About 2 years ago, my Nana brought home a Ouija board that she found at a yard sale. I have always been a true believer in the paranormal, and it's always been one of my peak interests. I have heard or read enough stories and watched enough shows to know not to mess around with a Ouija board, and quite frankly, they kind of freaked me out, so I wanted nothing to do with it. My Nana, on the other hand, doesn't believe in the paranormal whatsoever, and thought it would just be a fun game for myself, my brother, and the oldest of my 2 cousins. I left it on the dining room table for days before she made me put it away. I ended up sliding it under my bed in hopes of just forgetting about it. My brother, 11, and my cousin, 12, bugged me about it constantly because they wanted to play with it and I wouldn't let them. I tried to explain to them that it wasn't just a game, and that it shouldn't be messed with, but they were preteen boys who couldn't help but do things that they shouldn't. One day after I got home from work, the boys were there and I had this sneaking suspicion that they played with it. I looked under my bed and it was there, but I just had this odd feeling. That's when I went downstairs and interrogated them about it. At first, of course, they denied it, but I saw right through them until they finally admitted that they had in fact played with the board. I asked them if they had said goodbye when they were done, and they claimed that they did. My cousin likes to over-exaggerate stories big time, and makes things up to be overly dramatic, so when he told me about a couple of things that supposedly happened, I didn't believe him at all. Also, they were boys who liked to mess with each other, so I assumed that's what was occurring. Anyways, a couple of nights later I got in bed, and as I lay there trying to fall asleep, I got this feeling like I was being watched. I looked over at my closet, which has 2 sliding doors, and I noticed one of the doors is slightly opened, leaving a small space. It creeped me out for some reason, so I turned and faced the other way, trying to ignore everything and just fall asleep. I finally passed out, and the next thing I know, I'm woken up by what felt like someone or something hitting me in the back of the head. I was lying on my back, so the back of my head was fully on my pillow, which made it even weirder. And it wasn't a light hit either. It scared me so bad. I was shaking. I look around my room and I don't see anything, but then all of a sudden I hear my floor creaking like someone is walking around my bed. After laying there for a good little while, I finally got the courage to get up and grab my phone and book it to my living room. I sat and tried to calm down. I could still feel a tingling, pulsating sensation at the back of my head. I turned on my phone and realized it was 3 in the morning. I called my boyfriend, now husband, with tears streaming down my face from being so freaked out. He didn't pick up, and I swear I called him another 15 to 20 times before I finally gave up. I sat in the chair until my Nana got up around 6. I didn't tell her what had happened, because I knew she wouldn't believe me and would say I was acting stupid. After she got up, I had breakfast and then called my boyfriend again, and he finally answered. He told me he had his phone on silent mode so that he didn't know that I had been calling. I gave him so much crap for this, let me tell you. I told him what had happened and he felt so bad and felt like an idiot. He told me he would have come over in a heartbeat to comfort me and was so apologetic. Later that day, he came over and we took the Ouija board to a junkyard to get rid of it. My husband is the only one in my family that knows what happened, and I didn't experience anything again after I got rid of the Ouija board. So once again, moral of the story, Ouija boards should not be messed with. A while back, I was chosen to be in an indie film about jinns, basically the local versions of demons. Before I continue, there are 4 things you should know about them. 1. It is said that they can take the form of animals and humans with circle eyes, literally circles for eyes. 2. They are supposedly born from smokeless fire. 3. They feed on energy, such as the energy you use to stay awake and the energy used to power electronics. And 4, an extra one. There are Christian jinns, Muslim jinns, you name it. They have their own free will, so everyone is different. Some are very nice, others not so much. So now for the tale. We were filming in the desert and a series of events started to occur. Right when we arrived, there was instantly a presence of something there. Then a knife, bent, twisted, with red marks, started appearing at my feet every 15 meters or so. Constantly, for the entire time that I was in the desert, this knife would follow me. 4 nights or so into filming, right as we were packing up, a loud screech could be heard. It was sort of a mix between a falcon, a wolf, and a mountain lion. It was later revealed to us by an expert of desert animals that there were no animals in the desert that made that sort of sound. On the 5th night, things began to get interesting. At one point we were sitting down taking a break when the sand just started to smoke. We thought that maybe a small plant had combusted because of the heat. After a minute or two, the smoke stopped. We checked and there was no plant. We sat back down, and the second our butts hit the seat, boom, the sand all around the smoking area and where the smoke had been burst into flames, with 0 reasons to. Then, after that, all of our cameras started to lose their batteries very, very quickly. This was frightening because 1, it meant that we had to stay there longer, and 2, as mentioned in number 3 at the top, they feed on energy. The next night, albino scorpions, which are extremely rare, started sprinting toward the actors, literally going at full speed. We were forced to kill these rare creatures by burning them with a torch, and every time one died, 2 would replace it. Literally, 2 more would come out of nowhere, full speed ahead. This continued for several minutes. Things like this kept happening for the entire 2 weeks or so that we were at the site. When we finished filming, we split up for a bit to let the director edit some stuff. Then we had to film parts at a house. It is important here to mention that the movie was called 3 a.m. We were talking and one of the actors stated that since we had to split up, he had woken up at 3 a.m. every morning, his dogs going crazy, his alarm clock going off, and his AC setting itself to 3 degrees Celsius. 2 of the other actors revealed that the same thing had been happening to them. At the same time, I had never felt alone while I was in my room at night. Something was watching us. It followed us home. Since then, we have finished the film. I've started praying for protection every night based on the events that have happened. The actor who originally had the alarm go off at 3 a.m. moved to another house. Another actor moved to Canada. We were filming in UAE, which is in the Middle East, so this was pretty far away. A second actor also moved internationally, and I am moving in 4 weeks or so. I'm just hoping that it doesn't follow me home again. This happened when I was around 9 or 10. I was staying the night at my friend Catherine's for the first time. We met the summer before and were inseparable ever since. Kat lived in this old 2-story house surrounded by woods and dirt road. The house itself gave me an uneasy feeling when I first saw it. The shutters were falling off. The paint on the house seemed to be fading. It was an old piece of crap now that I think about it. But at the time, I was nervous and excited. I remember walking in after I stared at the house for what seemed like 20 minutes. Surprisingly, the inside was a lot nicer than the outside, so I pushed that uneasy feeling down and just shrugged it off as nerves. I remember the smell of the house. I can't pinpoint it, but it was different, like walking into a musty room. I started to walk around just to explore my surroundings, but I noticed Kat's mom watching me. I simply smiled and waved, but she just stood there staring at me wide-eyed. I've never met her before, but why was she looking at me like that? Suddenly, Kat flew around the corner and tackled me. We both fell and started to giggle. I noticed Kat's mom out of the corner of my eye start to turn around and walk off. She was gone, just like that. Fast forward a couple hours. Kat and I are laying on a beanbag in her room watching Children of the Corn, which, by the way, was one of my favorite movies at the time. I grew up watching horror movies, mostly Stephen King or any movie my mom was watching. Not her decision, mine, because I love the feeling that a good horror movie gives you. She felt the same way, and that's why we clicked so much. Back to the story. We were sitting here watching this movie, and suddenly the door opposite us slams closed. We both jumped, giggled, and brushed it off because, well, we were kids. Until the second time, when it creaked open and slammed again, not even seconds after the first time. Now I'm sitting there staring at this door, trying to figure out how in the hell it's opening and closing by itself. In the midst of all that, the only other person in this house is her mom, who I figured out earlier was just a tad bit creepy. "You think it's just your mom?" I asked her, but she shook her head. "You sure?" I asked again, but she said something that gave me chills, and still gives me chills, just telling this story. "My mom isn't home, it's just me and you, silly." I just stare at her while she's staring at me, trying to wrap my head around what she had just told me. "Where is your mom?" I asked her. "She's at work." I giggled, thinking that she was just trying to trick me. "She is at work. She only works for a couple hours, so she leaves me here because she trusts me." At this point, I'm just looking at her, and she noticed this look of concern on my face. "What's wrong?" she asked. "If your mom is at work, then who was that lady looking at me earlier?" As I said this, we heard what seemed like footsteps at the time, but thinking about it now, it sounded like shuffling in one spot above us. I'm completely terrified at this point. Every hair on my neck is standing on end, and I just want to leave. I start to get up when Kat pulled me back down and asked me if I had heard the noise. I nodded. It was silent again until the footsteps were back, but louder and faster. We both gazed up at the ceiling and she grabbed my hand. "This happens every day," she whispered. I look over at her and can truly see the fear on her face. The footsteps stopped and she looked at me, her face flushed white. "Is there an attic?" I asked. She pointed up toward the ceiling. "Well, maybe it's just squirrels or birds," I kept thinking over and over. "You ever notice when you're really quiet? That's when you can hear almost everything around you. Imagine if you're sitting in a house with your best friend alone at 10 years old and you hear the giggle of a 3-year-old child. Mind you, she has no younger brothers or sisters. We were completely alone. Kat was just as scared as I was. I remember thinking that I just wanted to get out of the house. Just grab her and run out the door. At least we would feel safer and less scared outside than we would in. "Want to hear a story?" Kat asked, pulling my mind back to reality. I nodded. "Well, this house used to be a daycare. There was this lady that would watch the kids, and one day she just locked them in the attic and then hung herself from a rope in the kitchen. They all died because the kids were hungry and thirsty and no one found them for months. In this house." My heart started to pound. My eyes were wide with fear. "It's true," she said. "I've seen them, the little kids, every day. But I never saw the lady, but you have. Earlier." After she told me this, I don't remember much else aside from running out the door of her room and making it outside that house. Kat followed, begging me to stay, but I just had to leave. My stomach felt like it was in knots. I felt like I had walked into a horror movie myself, and just wished that this day had never happened. Fast forward to years later. That was the last day that I had seen or heard from Kat. I remember her always coming to play outside at my dad's during the day. I remembered what she looked like. I remembered meeting her parents and seeing them out in public. I'm now 27, and I can't seem to find any proof that she even existed. All my friends that I was friends with then, I'm still friends with now, even after all these years. But why not her? I drove by that house maybe 15 times, and still wonder if maybe she was just one of the ones that never made it out. I was a sergeant in the U.S. Army and getting out from the military when President Bush ordered more troops into Iraq in 2003. I had just returned home into Austin, Texas when I was called into my local National Guard unit at Camp Mabry and told that I was being recalled to the Army, but the unit was already tasked out to deploy to Iraq. I was not part of their unit yet, so the commander offered to give me a waiver to deploy with a government contractor, Halliburton, in Houston. I knew that I would make more money as a contractor, so I took the offer. Not long after arriving in Kuwait at Camp Doha, I began working with the operations team overseeing logistics affairs. We would oversee the daily convoy of supply between Kuwait and Baghdad, a route riddled with IED incidents, small arms skirmishes, and almost constant breakdowns of Army and civilian vehicles. Because I was an SAW gunner in the 1st Infantry Division while in active duty and was technically still in the Guard, I was often in the convoys manning a mounted weapon that accompanied the mostly civilian convoys. During these runs, we had a few strange encounters in an area south of Baghdad, known then as Camp Babylon. Occupied by French troops, but then designated an archaeological site for obvious reasons, Camp Babylon was set up in the area that was said to be originally inhabited by the famous Tower of Babel. Indeed, there were ruins there that did look like a massive structure once stood at that spot. I had 2 strange incidents happen to me while passing through there. The first incident seems to be a bit benign, but sets the mood for the second. We were passing through Camp Babylon in the afternoon one day when our convoy took small arms fire. The SOP at the time, standard operating procedure, was to stop the convoy and return fire. This was because in the past, such incidents ended up being a long gunman attempting to scare the convoy into running into IEDs on the road. Because of this, the standard operating procedure changed to stop the convoy, dismount, and return fire. While engineers looked for explosive devices on the road, we scanned the horizon for enemies. Nothing. They most likely fled immediately. However, the ruins around Camp Babylon were alive with shadow figures that seemed to move about the area. Several times we would spot the figures, but they would instantly disappear. A contractor lying beside me with his weapon commented, "How odd that we were in the shadow of Babel and fighting the supernatural." I didn't respond, but knew that he was a 32nd degree Mason who was really into the arcane aspects of Babylon, etc. I didn't feel at the time that much was supernatural, but certainly did see the shadowy and bizarrely small figures dart about the structures. Once the road was deemed clear, we continued on to Baghdad. The second incident occurred about a month later. At this point, the weather in southern Iraq and Kuwait had turned quite cold at night. During this encounter, we had just completed the supply run to Baghdad and were returning back to Camp Doha in Kuwait when a vehicle in our convoy broke down. Once again, we found ourselves right at Camp Babylon. While the Army mechanics took a look at the vehicle and the rest of us took up fighting positions around the area, strange things began to occur. It started with a strange light bobbing in the desert. Thinking it was a person with a flashlight, we used night vision goggles to watch. It was simply a glowing ball of light moving toward a set of ruins. After initial contact with the light, a few of us had moved forward away from the convoy to see what the source was. After seeing it was self-contained and not a person, we were a bit alarmed. Then we all heard a sound that I will never forget. A long wailing began from one of the ruined structures and foundations not far away. It sounded like a woman in agony mixed with loneliness. On and on the sounds went while we huddled in the cold and dark, wondering what the hell we were listening to. With our night vision goggles equipped, we used our flashlights to spot the ruins. If you've ever done this, you'll know that a normal flashlight with NVGs looks like a massive beam of light. We scoured the area, but no source of the wails or the ball of light were seen. About this time, we were told via radio that the vehicle was repaired and ready to roll, so we decided to return to the convoy. I was slinging my SAW over my shoulder when I noticed my contractor partner was staring at the ruins in horror. He was frozen. I shook him and he snapped out of his stupor, quickly leaving the area with the rest of us. Once we were back at the camp and it was pleasantly daylight the following morning, several of us were chatting about the encounter at Camp Babylon before our daily operations briefing. It was then that I remembered the terrified expression on the face of the contractor, so I asked him about it. He was still obviously traumatized by the event, but managed to explain that as we were leaving our position on the sandy hill, he saw a tall, black figure standing beside the ruins. It was watching us as we were looking for it. He said that he felt an instant wave of despair hit him and thought that he was going to die. He didn't even remember leaving the area. His next memory was in the Humvee, headed back to Kuwait. I now write nonfiction books about haunted places for Llewellyn Publishing and have visited hundreds of reputedly haunted spots. But I'll never forget the wailing figure at the ruins of Babel. It's also worth noting that when I related this story to some of our Pakistani employees at Camp Doha, they were also quite terrified. One of them, a translator we called Ardi, said that we had encountered a Jinn, or a damned spirit, and that we were lucky to be able to tell the tale. I agree. This experience left me pretty shaken up for a while. To begin, I was a fairly depressed and antisocial 15-year-old in high school, and on weekends I'd go and stay with my older sister in her apartment to get away from my parents and finally just relax. During this time, I'd gotten into studying astral projection, and I'd always been interested in the paranormal, as my mom and I had experienced things in our house, and my mom claimed that she could see the spirits. Anyway, one day after some reading, I decided to take the bus over to Toys R Us, where they still to this day sell Ouija boards to kids. I bought one of the silly glow-in-the-dark ones. My sister and I were really excited to start using it. Within a few minutes of putting our hands on the planchette, it began moving in a circle. Our first introduction was a little girl named Sarah. We end up chatting with this little spirit all night. Then, it turns into every single weekend. We begin to feel almost addicted to the board, always going to chat with Sarah. It was a long time ago, but I remember her saying that she was from the 1800s. She'd be so excited to talk every time we showed up. The planchette would spin in circles all over the board. We could even take our hands off of it, and it would continue to move. The addiction to the board goes on for months. Finally, one day we decide to ask Sarah to physically show us that she exists. We ask for a sign, and a strong breeze shoots straight into my ear so hard that I jumped back from the board. There was no AC on, no windows open, and no fans in the room. From here on, things get odd, and Sarah says that she is attached to me. I started getting an off feeling, and I ask, "Are you really Sarah, or are you someone else? Some of the things you say are pretty adult for a young girl." Then the planchette began to playfully spin all over the place, ending on no. I feel a sense of almost maniacal laughter in the air. It's hard to explain, but my sister feels it too. Turns out Sarah was actually a man named Solomon. Solomon said that he loved me and that he was going to follow me. From there, we were freaked out and decided to stop using the board, but the pull was strong, and it legitimately feels as if it were an addiction. After this incident, I can almost always feel someone watching me when I'm alone. I'd see the shape of a man in my head, and the dark windows at night, but just for a second, enough to make me think I was losing my mind. I was frequently exploring church with my sister and was so scared from seeing figures pass by the windows and from feeling someone standing behind me that I told the preacher about our Ouija board use. He said he would pray and that I would have to ignore the spirit. Not the greatest advice. A month later, I had an odd and terrifying dream. Suddenly I'm above my body and in the den in my parents' house where I'd fallen asleep on the couch late at night. I look down at myself and then feel a presence by my body's head behind the couch near the hallway. There is a man standing there. He's wearing a black leather jacket, fitted, vintage-looking jeans, dark boots, kind of 40s, 50s-ish biker style. He was probably in his mid-20s. He had pale skin, dark, short-cut hair, and totally black eyes. He's almost attractive, if he weren't terrifying. He smiles at me eerily, and at light speed, jumps for my body. I panic and jump too, trying to get back into my body before he does. I wake up in a panic, sweating and shaking. Somehow, I eventually fall asleep at first light. And then when I awaken in the late afternoon, my mom tells me that she woke up to use the bathroom at night and fell to the ground in the living room having a seizure. I didn't know what to do or say. I was shocked. Could it have been from the paranormal encounter? Because she's a sensitive too? She used antidepressants frequently and switched them around a lot. But what a strange coincidence for it to happen that night. After that incident, life just continued on. So much of my teenage life felt negative at that age already that I just kept trekking forward, feeling someone behind me on some days not. The energy in my family's home was generally bad. Parents fighting constantly, father using drugs, mom in different phases of her bipolar. Definitely some energy a bad spirit or two could feed on. Fast forward to sophomore year in high school. I used to sit in the corner in band doing homework quietly, and one day a girl known as the school witch comes up to me. We maybe talked a few times, but didn't know each other very well. She simply states, "So there's a man following you, a spirit. I'm going to do a spell for you tonight to make him leave." Once again shocked, I tell her that there has been someone following me. She nods like, yes, obviously, then walks away before I can say anything else. By junior year, I'm dating a boy who lost his brother to suicide only months before we'd met. One night he calls in a panic and states that he was brutally attacked by a male spirit or demon in a dreamlike yet awake state. He said he felt someone sitting on him and could see a black spirit in the room. He called his brother's spirit to save him. He claims he felt a whoosh of energy and that his brother pushed the spirit off of his chest. He woke up really scared, saying that he'd never felt anything like it and that he'd never had negative spirit encounters before except as a small child. What scares me is that he'd randomly have episodes after this that made him not in his right mind or almost mad. At the time, I'd felt and seen his brother's spirit twice, and it was never a hostile feeling. I felt somewhat protected while dating him because of this, but Solomon's negative spirit was something I still worried about and felt on occasion. Years go by, and I eventually become best friends with a girl whose family ghost hunts. We ghost hunt together, experience some creepy stuff, and I become less fearful. 2 years into our relationship, I get the courage to tell her psychic aunt my story, and she seeks to find out more about this spirit. She connects with him and laughs some. He's 5150, hun. He's absolutely mad. He's not necessarily evil, but he attached himself to you because he likes how easily he can scare you. He doesn't necessarily want to hurt you, but your fear gives him pleasure. In life, it seems, he was quite mentally ill. I was absolutely stunned. It all made so much sense, and how would she know this? After the talk, my best friend and her aunt tell him to F off, and to imagine a white light and to let him know he's not welcome. This seems forward. But one night I feel the presence and it angers me. Years of someone just wanting to scare me. I yell at the empty room that I'm not afraid of him and that he's not welcome. I use sage, imagine white light, and yell for him to leave. I feel a stir in the energy, almost like he's not even that angry to leave. It felt more like an annoyance at losing his fear target. From that point on, I've had the upper hand. There was one more experience with him one day at 25 while in a toxic living situation. This was 6 years after the experience with my friend's aunt. I left my body again and was excited. Finally, astral projecting as an adult. I sit up, and lo and behold, there he is, standing by the bed. But this time I shoot white light at him. He's gone in an instant. Then my toxic roommate at the time walks through the wall to grab me. I wake up. Was he trying to warn me? Does he still visit me? Can I ever make him leave for good? Sometimes I wonder if he ever felt compassion for me. It was all so strange, and I frequently meditate and banish negative spirits or energy from around me. I've shut down a lot spiritually because of these incidents. I constantly state that nothing is allowed to bother me, but I wonder if somehow he'll be there forever. It worries me sometimes, especially because he'd stated on the board that he didn't want anyone to have me. I feel confident that spiritually I am strong, but I've always wondered if there was some deeper level of banishing that I could have, or should have done, or could still do. Anyway, I wanted to share this story because it's been both such a weight and a mystery to me for so many years. I don't know what I believe anymore. Sometimes I wonder if my extremely negative state of mind drew him to my depressed teenage self. Maybe somehow I created this negative entity? I doubt that one, but it is still possible. I feel in a much better place mentally, physically, and spiritually now, so I don't feel threatened by spirits, or really believe that he is around anymore. But who knows? I sage and cleanse my place almost daily and feel it to be a safe and light space. I will say that there is still so much I don't know when it comes to all of those incidents. I have an attic in my house, and ever since I was young, I hated going up there. It was dark, because there was no light, and it was always absolutely freezing. It had a really bad energy, and my anxiety would skyrocket whenever I had to go up there with my dad. It felt like someone had set a timer, and time was running out, if that makes sense. It was like I had to get out of there ASAP, or something would happen. In 2016, my parents decided to convert the attic and make it into their bedroom. After this happened, I noticed a lot of unexplainable events. One day, I was off from school and I was home alone. I was lying on my bed watching Jeremy Kyle show clips with both of my cats on the bed with me. Then I heard what sounded like someone walking down the stairs from the attic. It's a very distinct sound, and I knew it was the stairs creaking as they were new and didn't normally make any noise. I paused the video and listened. I didn't hear anything, so I continued watching, now a little on edge. 2 minutes later, I heard the footsteps again. Peanut, my cat, started hissing and meowing and went to the end of my bed and hid. At this point, I was tearing up. I somehow managed to get out of bed and pull my dresser in front of my door. I sat in front of the door and called my dad, sobbing. I explained to him what was happening and he said, "Go out of my room and look." Hell no. I begged him to call my neighbors to come in and get me. It was only after I called my dad 5 times, he kept hanging up on me, that he called my neighbors. One of my neighbors, who have a key, came in. I flew down the stairs, sobbing and shaking. My neighbor checked the house, but no one was there. I didn't feel safe staying home for weeks after this. My best friend and I would hang out after school at my house most days, and whenever we did, we would always hear noises from upstairs. One time in particular, we were in the kitchen making noodles, and we heard banging. I assumed it was my cat and didn't think much of it. My friend then shushed me and said to listen. From upstairs, I could hear the sound of someone opening and closing a chest of drawers and slamming my wardrobe open and shut. Now, my cats are loud, but how on earth does a cat open up a drawer? It's a very distinct sound. We ended up waiting in my back garden holding a paint scraper and a knife until my dad came home. This is by far one of the scariest ones. My dad called up the stairs to me and said he was going to the shops. Once he left, I went downstairs to grab some food. I asked my sister if she wanted anything to eat, and she said yes. She was in the front room, so I was talking to her from the kitchen. My dad knocked on the door, and I yelled at her to get it. She didn't. I went to answer it, giving it to her for being lazy. When I opened the door, in came my dad and my sister. After months of noises, banging, hearing people talking and walking around when I was home alone, I was sick of it. I felt anxious to be in my own home, and I had other things to worry about. So one day I decided to try to talk to whatever it was that was in my house. I didn't use a Ouija board. I just sat on my stairs and had a chat, I guess. I told him that I respect that they were in this house before I was, but that they were scaring me and stressing me out. I asked if they would be able to leave or at least stop frightening me. After this, I've never had anything happen in my house. No banging or noises. I think that it was the spirits of the previous owners, a nice elderly couple who sadly died in the house of natural causes. Whilst I've always been skeptical and evidence-based, I've never been able to shake this experience. My mother and her sisters have all had what may be termed as paranormal experiences, but without my personal experience, I had only thought of them as intriguing stories. As I take after my mom, though, I'm male. It's possible that they may have a perception which I share. This might be relevant later. In the mid-1990s, when I was around 21, I moved into the top floor of a 3-story building in Birmingham, Edgbaston, UK, which had been converted into flats. Mine had its own small landing and separate bedroom and lounge/kitchen. I also had 2 kittens, who play their own role in this. Having previously shared a house with friends and being young, this was my first time by myself, which may explain the feeling. But it was a very tranquil place. With the exception of my current house, it was the most peaceful place I've lived in. Again, this may be relevant later. Nothing of any real pertinence happened for the majority of the time I lived there, but I would often be listening to music for hours with my eyes closed, absorbing every note, frequently Nick Drake, whom I had recently discovered, and felt as though someone was sitting there listening with me. I didn't pay too much attention to this, with my very scientific background and all. But the sensation was as though someone was sitting right next to you and you closed your eyes. You would know or sense that they were there. It's hard to explain, but it somehow felt nice and I got used to it, putting it down to my own imagination though. Fairly often, the 2 kittens would be playing in the lounge and both suddenly stop and stare at the same spot on the wall, then follow something around the room together. Again, I thought nothing of it for a while, but then realized that there was never an insect or reflection which they could have been looking at. Eventually, with the frequency of this combined with the feeling of a presence, whenever I saw them doing it, I would tell them to quote-unquote stop watching the ghost, although, of course, the tone in which I was using was very much tongue-in-cheek. Another curiosity with them was that they would refuse to enter the bedroom, or quickly leave if carried in there. It was something else I didn't pay attention to until much later. I had lived there for about a year and a half and decided that I would save some money and share a house with someone that I knew. When I told the landlord, he commented that of all his properties, this one was very much an outlier and that no one apart from me had ever stayed there more than a few weeks or a couple months, and that I had been there 18 to 24 months. So, a few weeks before moving out, the first noticeable thing happened. At the foot of my bed is an outside wall with a small window to the left. As I lay down in bed one night, the only light was moonlight and a distant street lamp. I closed my eyes and realized that although dark, I could still see the room around me. I thought my eyes must be open, so I scrunched them shut to be sure. It sounds odd, I know, but I could still see, and was definitely not asleep. I was both marveling at and trying to understand whatever craziness this was when I had what I could only describe as an out-of-body experience. I began floating up toward the ceiling, stopping at a few feet away, and then floated toward the foot of the bed and outside wall. Admittedly, I was now in a panic, as I didn't know what was happening, but the overriding fear was floating through the wall and not returning, so I tried to shake myself back down somehow. I then had that falling sensation that you get in dreams, and the jolt when you wake up. Despite feeling like I was awake the entire time, I put it down to having fallen asleep immediately and going straight into a dream. A week later, and my final week at the flat, I went to bed one night. I closed my eyes and again could see the room around me. As I looked around again with my eyes closed, I was first excited at being able to repeat this, but then remembered the out-of-body experience. That worried me, so I opened my eyes so that it might not happen again, but also to know for certain that I was awake. As I looked across to the diagonally opposite corner of the room where the window was, I looked slightly left at the standalone wardrobe and saw the image of a young woman standing there about 12 feet away, staring at me. Her image was formed by misty white and dark shadow, and I saw that she had long, straight, shiny hair as a standout feature. And no, this is way before the original Ring films. I can imagine what some people might think. Of course, it scared the living crap out of me. I tried to put it down to tired eyes and the moonlight making the shape, but then she slowly made her way to the bed and, as best as I could make out, leaned over as if she were about to kiss me goodnight. With all my bravery and rational thinking, I pulled the covers over my head, scared out of my mind, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did, and I don't know how long I laid there waiting, but I eventually went to sleep. I thought that was it, and the next day put it down to an overactive imagination despite what I've shared above. I later moved out without telling anyone of this for fear of being labeled a crazy person. A few weeks later, I'm with my dad in his car one evening, and we drive past the house. We both look at it and notice the lounge light is on in the top floor window. He says it looks like someone has moved in already, to which I replied, thinking that he would just laugh and call me silly, "Yeah, either that or it's the ghost." To my surprise, he looks at me with a stern face and asks if I'm being serious. That worries me. He pulls the car over and says that it's really important, and he's deadly serious, to let him know if there's anything I should tell him. So I start relaying to him what I've said above, and he's obviously concerned. He asks me to describe her, and once I have, he replies, "Yep, that's her." I think I was more shocked at that moment than the night I actually saw her. He then tells me, "When I said where you had moved to, your nan wanted you to move out right away, but we didn't say anything to you as we didn't want to worry you. Your nan's next-door neighbor had a daughter, and she was murdered in that flat by someone she worked with one New Year's Eve. My nan's neighbors were roughly the same age, so this would have been the late 60s or early 70s. You just described her exactly," he said. And the police said that when they found her, she had not long had a bath and had been strangled with her dressing gown belt. One thing they remarked upon was how long and shiny her hair was. still gives me chills. But this wasn't the end of it. At this point, I still hadn't told anyone apart from close family about my experience. I was trying to avoid the loony label. I was in my early 40s and working at a company as a software tester. As I say, my mindset is technical and fact-oriented. A guy starts on my team, 10 years my senior, but we have the same interests and personality, and we get on great. We're still friends to this day. A horror movie had just come out, so we're talking about it, which leads to talk of other similar movies, and then he tells me about a scary experience he once had himself. He said that he was lying in bed one night, and suddenly had the sensation of being strangled. He said it was so vivid that he swore it was real, but opened his eyes and no one else was there. He lived by himself in a flat. I asked him where this was. Same area. I asked him the road, same road, house number, flat, same one. He'd lived there about 10 years prior to my stay in it. That was the first time that I then told someone else about what I had been through. If this was paranormal, did she show herself to me because of the links between our families? Is this why the flat was so peaceful for me and not previous tenants, if that was why they had moved? Could I see her because of some ability, however small, which does run in my family? Is this what the kittens could sense? I've had a few other separate experiences, and so is my family, but they're for another post. Despite that experience, I'm still skeptical. There are so many questions that I just can't wrap my head around. For example, how would a spirit have conscious thought or action? How do clothes become part of an apparition? Why do we have little, if any, hard evidence? At the same time, I have no other explanation for what happened other than it was a lot of weird coincidences. I understand that to many this is just someone else's story, but at the same time, there is still an unthinkable amount of secrets to the universe that humanity has yet to unlock. When I was a kid, I lived in a one-story house that had a very small space that you could consider an attic. We didn't keep anything up there because it was such a small space. I don't even know where the entrance to it was, if there was one. But, and this started right as we moved in, after we would go to bed, I lived with my grandparents, I would start hearing footsteps up there. I knew they were footsteps because they would move in a rhythm and go from one end of the house to the other. I lived in that house from when I was 8 to 12 years old, and this happened every night. I repeatedly tried telling my grandparents about this, and they always said it was just the house settling. I was never able to sleep well as a kid, so while my grandparents would be asleep as soon as 8 p.m. struck, I would be lying awake in bed staring at the ceiling. It was always the most terrifying when the footsteps stopped right above me, like right over my bed, and then in a few seconds to minutes they would walk back to some other location up there. Nobody ever believed me that this was happening. My granddad had even found holes that had apparently been drilled in several of the walls, one in the bathroom, and he wrote it off as a previous owner running cables through the walls. Lived in that house for 4 years, and was convinced that someone was living in the ceiling above us and would become active when they thought that we had gone to sleep. I'll never forget that. It always happened at the same time of night, right after we went to bed. This was back in the late 90s to the early 2000s, so I don't know if there could have been cameras or something that they could have been watching us on, but they definitely knew when we went to bed. I'm still to this day convinced that someone was up there. Paranormal? I don't know. It's worth mentioning that one of the previous owner's kids did die in the house. They had a wolf-dog hybrid as a pet that mauled him in the living room. Anyway, I thought I'd share that because literally no one believed me, ever, to this day. But I know that footsteps are different from houses settling. This would go on into the wee hours of the morning, and I would usually finally pass out when the footsteps had gone off to a different part of the house. Myself and a few friends go on a road trip every summer to visit haunted places. In 2018, we stayed at a haunted hotel in the northeastern United States and had to sign a safety waiver just to stay there. It was a small country hotel, and the only other party had canceled, so we had the place to ourselves with our tour guide. We had a spirit box type of device, which I've been skeptical of, but we all carried on conversations. There was a moment where I heard my name through the box, when I had never said my name, and even said my full name. I prefer a shortened version. We spent a lot of time upstairs in a room where the quote-unquote ladies of the night would sleep, and I was prohibited from sitting on the bed by a spirit that was allegedly the ladies' bodyguard. I sat down only for a few seconds, and as soon as I stood, the bed lifted up and dropped, scaring the hell out of me, and at least one of my friends witnessed this. We went upstairs to an unfinished floor that was under renovation. There was an old ornate chair that was used by a notorious Irish mafia hitman that stayed at the hotel frequently. We went in a circle saying our names to see if the spirit, Joe, would let one of us sit in the chair. I said mine, and a light that we were using started to flicker like crazy. This is especially odd because I have red hair, and as far as I know, I was the only one in our group of Irish descent. Our guide asked if he was sure that he wanted me to sit there, and he replied, "F yeah," through the box. I took the invitation and sat in the chair, and oddly enough, I felt some kind of strange power surge through me. I eventually stood and thanked Joe, and from the spirit box I heard, "You're welcome." Later that night is when the real event happened. Our guide said, "Now, I don't normally do this, but since there are only 4 of you, I'd like to take you down to the morgue." It wasn't so much of a morgue, but it was stone walls and a dirt floor, and it was cold as hell. We were in a corner of the room when our guide said, "I don't want to scare you, but there's something standing right behind you." I saw a shadow on the wall, but it was cast by my friend B. That's when B moved to the side, and there was another shadow underneath his. It was taller than anyone in the room, and gave off an intimidating presence. I looked back, and saw no one standing in front of the light source, and when I looked back again, there was no shadow. I've always been skeptical, but believed in the supernatural to a degree. Believe me when I say that basement had something seriously dark down there. Something evil. I have never felt so vulnerable in my life. The whole night we felt like we were being watched, and could hear footsteps around the hotel. I'd love to go back and get some more evidence someday. I've done paranormal investigations for a few years now, but that one night stay at that hotel was enough to completely convince me. There is definitely something beyond death, and perhaps the most terrifying part, not everything on that side is friendly. I was in the Marine Corps from 2008 to 2012. I served as an infantry Marine and was stationed in 29 Palms, California. In 2009, while training for my first deployment, we went to a specialty school called Marine Corps Cold Weather Mountain Warfare School, which was located in Bridgeport, California. I enjoyed the 5-ish hour bus ride up Highway 395 through the Sierra Nevada mountains. I took in the beautiful scenery as my mind wondered about what I was in for, dreading climbing the 12,000-foot mountains that littered the landscape. Weeks of training go by. I was relieved to hear that we were moving to a place called Hawthorne to do some live fire exercises. It was about 30 miles away to the east, back into the desert. An old, out-of-commission army base that was deemed uninhabitable in the 50s for various reasons. I was enthusiastic to escape the bitterly cold temps up on the mountain. Slept on the ride there. Upon waking, I looked out the window and was shocked at what I saw. Remnants of the old base scattered the landscape. Halfway destroyed buildings, guard towers, and other typical military stuff that you'd expect to see. Behind that lied jagged lava rock mountains casting their shadows over the destroyed buildings. The place looked like a nuclear bomb had gone off nearby. Have you ever seen the old nuclear test videos from when it was first developed? They would stage a fake town to analyze what the blast would do. This place was like that, mixed with that game series Fallout and Chernobyl, if you've ever heard of that. As we drove in further, I noticed a bunch of mine shafts heading into the sides of the mountains. Now, I was very curious as to where we would be staying at. I was relieved to hear that there was a makeshift FOB. Nothing fancy by any means, just an old green tent for the NCOs and upper-ranking battalion staff. Us boots would be sleeping under the stars, in the dirt. At least we had a makeshift Hesco wall around us to make things feel like home. During chow that evening, we were all sitting around talking. I asked my sergeant, what are all the mine shafts in the hillside for? He said they were munitions storage facilities as well as fallout shelter. The place was designed during the Cold War era, which made it super creepy. It's like all the people just decided one day to leave. Vehicles were still there, everything. It was strange. Night arrives. It was fairly hot out even though it was night as we were back down in the desert. I was having problems sleeping, even though I was just in my skivvies on top of my sleeping bag. Some of the others were awake talking, I could hear. I stared into the stars and mountains looming over me. It was a full moon that night with hardly any clouds. As I was scanning the mountaintops, which, if I had to guess, were around 500 to 700 feet above me, where we were all sleeping made it seem that I could almost reach out and touch the top. I saw something strange moving about at the peak. Figuring my eyes were playing tricks on me from extreme physical exhaustion and sleep deprivation, I disregarded it. Even later that night, I awoke to go take a pee. As I'm utilizing the head, I look up to where I saw something earlier. To my surprise, the strange, silhouetted figures were there, scurrying about the ridgeline. Now this has definitely caught my interest as my mind was wandering. Thankfully, I had a lot of cool stuff lying in my pack. Once at my gear, I grabbed my trusty PVS-14 night vision monocular. I bring them to my eye and look back up. Nothing? That can't be right. Like, huh? I swear I saw something. I look over to a buddy of mine that was awake and asked, "Hey, did you see anything up there?" He looks at me and says, "What are you talking about, bro?" I said, "Forget it." A few more hours go by through the night, and a loud crash comes from the closest mine shaft, which was located 100 feet or so from the FOB. Literally half the platoon sat straight up from a dead sleep. One of the sergeants screams from nearby and says it hit the rack. It was just some rocks falling, which made sense to most of us. The next morning, we woke up and did what we had planned to do for that day. Later that afternoon, we had some free time, and were creeping around checking the nearby buildings out. 4 of us decided to go down into a building. It was half above ground and half below. The wide staircase went down to open up into a larger cubicle-type area. Barely any light came through the small windows. I clicked on my weapon light and scanned the room. There were still papers and everything strewn about on top of the desks. We followed the hallway, which made a right turn. MOPP suits and gas masks lined the hallway, hanging on hooks. We see a sign above one of the doorways that said, "Girls' Locker Room." Us being the typical 19-year-old Marines that we were, we decided that we had to check that out. I took point and entered the pitch-black room. I was looking through the lockers to try and find something interesting when all of a sudden, the door behind us slams shut. We all ran like hell out the other door on the other side. This experience I had dates back to the second house that I lived in. When I was about 13, my nan moved in with us following my granddad's death, and with the sale of the 2 houses, we managed to move into a fairly big house with a massive garden. Just to put it into perspective, our neighbor's garden in a house in a previous time was a small tennis club with 3 courts, and wrapped around the back of our garden, just to give a perspective of the size of these gardens. So anyway, my bedroom was sort of attached, and above the garage to the side of the house, so I used to be able to see across my neighbor's garden and the gardens next door to theirs, whilst also being sort of detached from the rest of the house. We lived there for about 5 years, and nothing really happened. I went to uni and had some experiences which I've posted on another post. When I returned from uni, I picked up the dirty habit of smoking and not wanting my parents to know. I used to climb out of my window on the side of the roof of a shelter that we had outside my window and sit to smoke. When I was back for the summer after my first year, I was on this roof and I heard our neighbor's dog bark and go ballistic. He wasn't in the garden, but obviously by their back door. At the same time, their automatic backlight sensor switched the light on, and clear as day there was a black, and I mean really black, figure in their garden. It stood maybe around 5'10". Looked like a man's figure. It was just pacing up and down their decking, almost right below me. I initially crapped myself, thinking it was the husband and that for sure he had seen me smoking. I looked closer, frozen still. What I was seeing was almost hovering, gliding, effortless, not walking. Suddenly their back door opened, and the husband came out with the dog, and just like that, it vanished. I continued to see Steve out there, and the exact same routine occurred. That was almost every other night. I even kept a log at the time, looking for some sort of pattern. One night shortly after, about 8 weeks, my parents had a barbecue and my neighbors came. I brought this up with the gentleman's wife, who looked at me and laughed. She proceeded to tell me that the shadow's name was Steve. Steve had been in their house for the last 20 years, and she regularly sees him pacing the garden, walking down the stairs, opening and closing doors and cupboards, moving their possessions, almost like living as if they were not there. Her kids had seen him and grown up with him, but her husband had never, ever seen him. I was shook, but glad at the same time that I wasn't going crazy. I continued to see Steve right up until we moved out of the house a few years ago. If anything, I felt sad for him. It was almost as if he was unable to move on. I live in England in a 2-story flat, and I have always believed in the paranormal. But my dad does not believe in any type of ghost or anything supernatural. I never thought that this flat was haunted. However, as I got older, I started to feel uncomfortable by myself, and I saw shadows downstairs out of the corner of my eye. Now, there is an attic directly above our second floor, but there is no way for us to enter it, as you cannot access it from this flat. The only way to access this attic is by having a specific key that can open the attic, as it is council flats, which is above my neighbor's house. However, the attic above my flat is the only one which is blocked off, and there is no way to enter it. I have the last flat on the end of these 18 council flats. There are no neighbors above us, just the attic, which no one can access without that key, and they would still not be able to get above our flat. One night about 2 years ago, all of the family was in bed, and it was about 3 in the morning. All of a sudden, I heard something crash above. It was so loud that it woke all my family members up, and we all got up and stood on the landing together. After that bang, we heard 3 loud footsteps, and the sound of something being dragged behind these footsteps. It was so scary, as we know that nobody can physically get up there. My dad was not convinced that it was a ghost. He thought that somebody had somehow gotten into the attic, so he went outside to check if the communal attic door was opened. I followed him outside, and it was completely padlocked shut with heavy chains around the lock. I tried to explain to him, how can there be anyone up in our part of the attic when it's blocked off and impossible to get into? We came back into the house, and we were all quite shaken up. My brother was young, and was able to get to sleep, but I was awake all night. After this experience, I started to smell old cigarette smoke every time I would enter my toilet, and it was so stale and stagnant. After the event, me, my brother, and my mom were going away on holiday, whilst my dad had to stay there and work. He told me he slept with his headphones in every night, as even he felt uncomfortable by himself. As a family, we still have no idea what those noises were, and since then we have heard many strange things. All this started when I was in middle school. I was young and stupid and seriously interested in the paranormal. I grew up in a religious home, and I am still religious. I have no explanation for what happened to me. I started experimenting with the paranormal with my friends. We thought it would be really cool to use a Ouija board. At first, nothing seemed to happen, but then the board started to move. We asked all the normal stupid questions like, who's there, or is anyone here? It moved really slow and steady. I was sure that my friend was messing with me. I got spooked and we threw out the board. But that is not where this story ends. Moving forward, I started having really weird nightmares. I would consistently wake up at 3 a.m. or not be able to sleep at all. I was basically a zombie throughout my entire day. There was one time when I was at home alone on FaceTime when I heard my mom yell my name. I yelled back and didn't get a response. My friend then reminded me that I was home alone. I immediately checked my whole house and no one was there. She heard the voice too though, so it couldn't be explained. I continued hearing voices and knocks and was still unable to sleep. There was one time where I was in my room doing homework and someone pulled my hair so hard that my head actually yanked down. I got so spooked that I ran to my dad and told him what had happened. He obviously didn't really believe me. My brother started noticing weird things too, and that's when I got really uncomfortable. He and I were in my room, and I went to the bathroom. When I came out, his face was stone white. He claimed he saw a little girl run past my bedroom door. It couldn't have been me because I used the bathroom connected to my room. We don't have any other siblings. Another time I was on FaceTime again with a separate friend and I had my phone out in front of me when I walked into my bathroom. My friend asked, "What is that behind you?" And as soon as she said that, the lights shut off. I sprinted to my brother's room and of course nobody believed me again. The icing on the cake though was when I was asleep one night and I woke up suddenly. It was 3 a.m. again and I was completely paralyzed with fear. I couldn't move. All I could see was a hooded figure in all black staring at me from the corner of my room. I couldn't see its eyes. I just knew that it was looking at me. It began to float toward me, and then pressed all of its weight on my chest. I couldn't talk or move. After silently crying for what felt like forever, I finally croaked out the word Jesus, and it fled from the room through my door. After that incident, I told my mom everything about the Ouija board and the experiences, and she finally believed me. She could see how scared that I truly was and knew that I couldn't be lying. She immediately got to work and blessed me and the house. I haven't had anything that terrifying happen to me since, and I no longer live in that home. On our way home from a camping trip, my family stopped by the Oak Springs Trilobite site to fossil hunt. If you don't know the southeastern Nevada desert, the attractions are low to moderately traveled, and you will often be one of the only visitors. This site in particular was empty, and we were the only people there. A quarter-mile trail leads you to a shale deposit where you can sift through for fossils. Shortly after starting out, I heard a man call out conversationally. Not really shouting, but talking loudly enough to communicate with someone a distance away. I was facing west on a south-facing slope, and he sounded like he was down and to the left, closer to me than the highway. I paused and took a look around. There was no dust, or engine noises, or anything like that. No crunching of footsteps. Nothing. There were flies buzzing about, and I decided that a bug had just buzzed in my ear. A minute later, I heard another man call out, this time up the slope to my right. Probably just another bug. Sounds can get weird in rocky canyons, so it was no biggie. We came upon the site, dug around for about 30 minutes, and found a few unimpressive specimens, so we headed back for the truck. At this point, I had forgotten all about the voices. Driving away, I asked Hubs, "What did you think? Pretty cool?" I'm the rock hound, and never know if he's enjoying my hobby as much as I am. He replied, "Sure, yeah, it was actually pretty cool." Pause. But I kept hearing these voices, and I couldn't tell where they were coming from. He had a face shield up over his ears at the time, making it unlikely that a bug could have possibly buzzed in there. He said that he was hearing them on the way back to the truck, and heard them calling out at least 3 times. Caliente is nearby, and Pioche a ways further, and both towns have histories dating back to ye olde mining days and Mormon frontiering. There are lots of railroad, gunfight, and native raid stories, and some weird Warren Jeffs type stuff. Not to mention Area 51 being sorta/relatively nearby. Now, we are both atheists and skeptics. We don't believe in ghost stories, and neither of us have ever had a paranormal experience. But this one has us scratching our heads. My mom and I moved into a house when I was in the 5th grade. For the record, I'm 25 now. And there was a room in the attic that looked like it was actually built to be part of the house and not some makeshift DIY room. The attic was also not your typical attic with a pull-down door, but a walk-through door. Anyway, the layout was that it made an L shape, and all wooden, and the room was obvious at the end of the L. We used the attic for Christmas decorations and whatnot. But anyhow, on with the story. I turned the room into my little hangout area. The only thing in there when we moved in was a wooden table with 4 chairs and then some weird bench that I hear was a bed, but it didn't look big enough. So me and my friends would always go in there to hang out, play games, and whatnot. Well, one day I accidentally broke the table and was worried that my mom was going to be mad at me. I don't think she would have cared since the stuff was so old. But out of fear, I just grabbed all the stuff that I owned and left the room, closing the door behind me. I think I remember once going back in there a few years later, like 9th grade maybe, but never actually spent an extended period of time. I would always stack the Christmas decorations in front of the wall and door to it. The year before we moved, we decided to move everything into the garage after Christmas for my senior year in high school. That way we didn't have to deal with it when the movers showed up. We never used the garage anyway, but got rid of lots of stuff the year prior, so we had plenty of room. That was the last official time I saw the door. But the absolute last time I stepped foot in that house, the stuff was all packed away, on the truck preparing to leave, and I was doing one last walkthrough when I decided to go into that room and make sure that I didn't forget anything and leave it behind. I went to go to the attic, and it was missing. Nothing but a blank wall. Like there was no way a room could have ever even have been there. I was shocked and asked my mom, but she had no idea. I even called my friends to verify, and yeah, they all remembered the room, but she didn't. It was odd. Very odd. I never felt anything weird about the room at all. Like, I'm pretty sensitive to paranormal stuff, and this just seemed like some random room. The house, in my opinion, was haunted because a guy hung himself in the living room, but I don't believe that that was connected. I, a 23-year-old female, just wanted to share what I would call my first real encounter. Even as a lifelong skeptic, I can't explain this. If you're familiar with U.S. ghost hunting spots, you might have heard of the Copper Queen Hotel in Bisbee, Arizona. It has been open since 1902 and has been the subject of multiple paranormal investigations and shows, and there are supposedly 3 documented ghosts who inhabit it. That of a drowned child, a man in a top hat, and a forlorn prostitute. My boyfriend and I decided on Saturday morning that we would take a trip to make up for a missed birthday. We had never gone on a real trip together, so we didn't plan it well at all. We just realized that we were about an hour and a half from Bisbee and decided to book a hotel once we got there. We chose the Copper Queen because it was the most prominent hotel in the area and is right in the middle of everything. We weren't aware of its reputation as a paranormal hotspot. The room itself was antique-looking, as expected with a hotel that old. Yellowing wallpaper, splintering wood floors, dim lighting. The locks on the door were pretty flimsy, and you had to actively yank it shut or it would fall open again. We joked that it looked like the Tower of Terror. After a day of walking around, we came back to get changed. We heard a creaking noise, and I had Coop check under the bed, only half seriously, but I was still relieved that nobody was there. We grabbed a lighter and went out for a smoke, then came back, showered, watched TV for a little while, and then turned out the lights. The moment that we shut the lights off, there was a variety of clicks, creaks, and pops in odd patterns. It being an old room, and us being a logical couple, we figured that it was the old fan or the wall-mounted AC. I was just listening to the noises when I felt Coop freeze up next to me. "Is that you?" I responded no, that it was the AC. "Not that. Seriously, is that you?" I asked him what he meant and waited for a minute or so before asking again, and again. Finally, he answered. "I was trying to listen, babe. I hear someone breathing." We reasoned that it was the room next door and settled back into our pillows, and then I remembered that there wasn't another room on that side. Our room was the first on the landing, and the side that we were closest to, the side that Coop would have been able to hear if at all, was the main staircase. Coop, being a 21-year-old boy, is blessed with the ability to fall asleep within seconds. I could hear him snoring, and his legs were over mine, but I was too anxious to sleep. I then felt the lightest tap on top of the quilt, just next to my feet. I froze, but tried to reason with myself that Coop had just twitched in his sleep, although his legs were still on top of mine. A few moments passed, and I thought that I had imagined it, and then I felt a pinch/tugging motion at the same area of the quilt. I woke up Coop and demanded that he check under the bed again. I was still reasoning that there was a non-supernatural explanation for the events, and it occurred to me that although we had checked before leaving our walk, we hadn't checked after. The flimsy lock and the fact that the door was difficult to close made it seem likely that someone could have snuck in. Coop was too groggy to be useful, so I grabbed my phone, turned the flashlight on, and leapt as far from the bed as I could while crouching to check what was under it. Nothing. We were both a little freaked out by this point and agreed to turn the TV back on to drown out any weird noises. We turned on Futurama and settled back into bed for the third time. Again, Coop fell asleep within seconds. I was drifting off when I heard the audio on the TV kind of cut somehow. It suddenly shifted tone to where it sounded like a grainy VHS instead of a streaming adult cartoon. I heard a woman saying something about a phantom, and then a blood-curdling scream from the TV. At this point, I was too scared to open my eyes, so I steadied my breathing and pretended to be asleep. That's the last event that I could recall, and upon checking out the next day, the manager asked if we had experienced anything. That's when we Googled the hotel and found out its history of hauntings. So there it is. Nothing too crazy compared to other posts here, but I have definitely never experienced anything like that before and don't have an explanation besides the paranormal. About 11 years ago, a group of friends and myself drove to Mineral Wells, Texas for a spontaneous midnight exploration of the long-abandoned and supposedly haunted Baker's Hotel. It was incredibly creepy inside. The place was pitch black and littered with old pieces of dusty, moldy furniture and decor from the 50s and 60s, whenever it was last operating. The first thing that freaked us out was that it sounded like the building was breathing. And loudly. Turned out it was just flooding in the basement that was echoing through the elevator shafts. Anyways, we started exploring everywhere. By the time we got to the 7th floor, we were a little disappointed that nothing weird had happened yet. The adrenaline was kinda wearing off. We started walking down this long hallway on the 7th floor, peeking into various rooms and peering around with our flashlights. All of a sudden we heard a door, coming from the end of the hallway we were moving toward, slowly open, and then slowly close. It was creaking very loudly, just like in a scary movie. It scared us, and we froze. We were close enough that our flashlights reached the door in question. It was some kind of small, weird door, framed inside of a larger, regular door. My friend wanted to turn around and leave. We thought maybe there was a homeless person in there, and they were trying to scare us off. Nonetheless, I convinced him to keep going because I had to go in the room now. We started walking slowly toward the door, all the while saying stuff out loud like, "We're just exploring, if someone's in there, we're just messing around," things like that. We were probably about 15-ish feet away when the door suddenly began opening again, eerily and slowly like before. However, this time, it slammed shut, right in front of our eyes. Again, we were scared frozen. Again, I insisted that we keep going. A minute or so later, we worked up the courage and just barged right in that door as fast as we could. What was in there? Absolutely nothing. There was no possible explanation for whatever had opened and closed and then slammed that door. There were no cracked windows allowing for the airflow from outside. There was nothing. We shut the door behind us and sat down in nervous disbelief, and then chain smoked a couple of cigarettes each. We finally left and actually went through the rest of the building. This story is from 2013. I travel a lot for work. I mean, before COVID. And when I do, I stay at hotels. Sleeping in a different bed doesn't bother me as I'm mostly a sound sleeper, and I'm used to it given that I've been doing this for a while. This was a hotel in the suburbs of Chicago. From the time I checked into the room, I think it was room number 413. I have never felt such a sense of dread, despair, and claustrophobia. I am a rational person, no history of depression or mental illness, so I explained it to myself that maybe the 13 in the room number was messing with my head. But I've stayed in other hotel rooms with a 13 in my assigned room number. I had also stayed at the same property every week over the last few months, but I had never felt this way. I pondered while lying in bed if I should call the front desk and ask for another room. I didn't know what excuse that I would give to them. Everything was great with the room. The shower was fine, the room was spotless, the toilet had no issues. It was a boring, predictable, clinically consistent room like any other Marriott property. No complaints on the Wi-Fi. I couldn't bring myself to lie to the front desk and ask to be changed to another room. So I told myself I was a rational man, a husband, a father, and a protector. I decided that I was going to stay put. The uneasiness didn't lessen, so I turned on every light in the room, took out all the Bibles from the bedstands, and set them next to me. I am not of the Christian faith, and not very religious either, but I felt like I needed all the protection I could get. So I played chants on loop on YouTube from my own religion all night at low volume until I went to sleep. I woke up in the morning, worked out, showered, and went to work. The night's experience felt like a fleeting memory during the day. I had a really fun rental that week, a Mustang GT, and it was so much fun the night's memory almost felt imaginary entirely. I came back from work that evening feeling a little silly about the night before, and went back to the room. In an instant, the same sense of unexplained dread and claustrophobia came flooding back. I just couldn't rationally explain it. So I went back to the routine from the night before. Lights on, chanting, Bible, Marriott Mormon Bible, all by the bed. Next evening, I spoke with the bartender and asked him if he had heard any weird complaints. He said he hadn't, but he'd ask around. When I came back the next week, I got a different room, but I checked in with the bartender. He said he had done a little digging over the weekend and picked up on gossip from the other hotel staff that some of the cleaning ladies didn't like that room and even that corner of the 4th floor. He was intrigued enough that he brought along a sensitive friend of his from his Episcopalian church and said that when she opened the door and had barely taken a step inside that she just made a 180-degree turn and came right back out. She couldn't even go inside and said that it felt heavy. The bartender said that it was enough to spook him. He said he just stood in the corridor and refused to go in after that. We kinda had a laugh about it and figured that we would Google the property address to see if there were documented murders or suicides, but there was nothing. The property changed hands a few times. There was a nearby fire with some deaths, but nothing notable as far as Google search goes. I didn't think much of it, but I have stayed more than 2,000 nights in hotels since the fall of 2013, and I have yet to experience that fear ever. I continue to rethink about the memory of my experience, trying to recount the details about the room, the week, maybe the mood at work, just so I could find something rational to explain what I had felt, and I have been unable to. This happened to me when I was in high school. I was at my friend's house at the time, who lived in an apartment building. She had a neighbor who lived upstairs, and was a few years younger than us, who we hung out with when I visited my friend's apartment. On this specific day, my friend's neighbor mentioned that she had a Ouija board, and asked if we wanted to use it with her. We both agreed, as I personally didn't think Ouija boards were actually paranormal, and thought it was a myth. We went into a garage area of the apartment building and put our fingers on the planchette. For the first few hours, nothing really even happened. Eventually, we had movement on the planchette and started asking questions to this spirit, who would answer us. I forgot who, but someone asked if the spirit was trying to communicate with anyone. Interestingly enough, it spelled out my name. I was skeptical, and thought it was one of my friends messing with me, so I asked what its name was. It then spelled out my grandmother's name, who died 6 months before this Ouija board encounter. I started getting a little uncomfortable, as my grandmother's name is in another language, and my friends did not know this language, nor have I ever told them what her name was. They wouldn't even know how to spell it either. Weirded out, I asked what my grandmother wanted. She started spelling out U-R-G-R, and then the planchette started going in weird circles, and even going off of the board, and wasn't spelling out anything that made sense. So I asked for further clarification, and then just "You are great" popped up. This will be important later, so keep that in mind. Anyway, at that point I thought it was just one of us moving it weirdly, so I said goodbye. A few days later, my grandmother's husband, my grandfather, suddenly passed away. It was unexpected, as he was in great health, and it was right before Christmas, and he was so excited for Christmas. As I was at his funeral, I remembered sitting there and thinking about the Ouija board, and that's when it hit me. When my grandmother initially tried to spell out something that started with G-R, I realized that grandfather starts with G-R. But then the planchette had moved around so weirdly when my grandmother couldn't spell out the rest of the word, as if something had been stopping my grandmother from completing the word and warning me. The next few months were hell, as I started blaming myself, and was convinced that I had somehow contributed to my grandfather's death by using this board. It got to the point that I became suicidal, and the scariest part is, my thoughts felt as if they were not my own. As if something were trying to lead me toward taking my life, as they were very dark. I can't explain it, as it could have been guilt. But I felt like something was watching me all the time and felt a strange presence in the next few months after using the board. There's also the fact that the night of when I used the Ouija board, I was in the bathroom and I was underneath some lights. I had a strange sensation and felt that I needed to walk away, but right when I did, the lights shattered and would have injured me if I had been standing underneath. I eventually confessed to my mother about the Ouija board experience, and right when I did, I felt a giant weight lift off of my shoulders. The negative and dark thoughts were slowly disappearing, and I started to not feel the dark presence anymore when I overcame these thoughts. However, I was still wondering if the spirit that I had contacted was even really my grandmother. I also wondered if I was imagining this dark presence and the dark thoughts that I had had. Fast forward, I was at an overnight event at my school and another friend brought a Ouija board. I decided to use it one more time with this friend and try to get some answers. At one point, the Ouija board said that it was trying to contact me specifically. When we asked who it was, it then started spelling out D-E-V. We started panicking, but then it spelled out to a word that I forgot. I dismissed it and thought it was nothing, but my friend decided to look up the word. A few weeks later, she told me that the word meant devil in another language. It was then confirmed to me that it may not have been my grandmother who was contacting me the first time. There's also the fact that there may have been something that was trying to get to me and did not have good intentions. To this day, I am convinced that this spirit only tried to warn me about my grandfather so that when he passed, I would have felt guilty. By feeling guilty, I was more vulnerable to the spirit's influences, to the point that I would almost take my own life. I do not know if this is what actually happened, but it's the only logical explanation that I have. I am a female in her early 20s. I live in the U.S. in a desert state, a town in the middle of nowhere. I come from a military family, generations of Air Force and Army, and a grandfather who was involved in Project Blue Book. I was sitting alone in my house, playing some Gwent on PS4, when my little sister and her friend came rushing through the door. I jumped out of my skin. It was midnight, and no lights were on. My sister, let's call her Yellow and her friend Brown, seemed a bit shaken and nervous, though she and her friend were laughing as if they were up to no good. I asked them what they were doing, and Yellow said, "We were out for a walk in the desert near the mountain." Keep in mind, my sister is 16. No reason for her and her 15-year-old friend to be out in the desert in the middle of the night. I was upset, but saw they were fine, so I shook it off. "What did you guys do?" Yellow and her friend looked at each other and went quiet. Her friend whispered, "Do we tell her?" And Yellow replied, "Nah, she won't believe us." And they walked into the kitchen without a further word. Needless to say, I wanted to know what was going on, so I followed and promptly asked, "Yellow, what's up? Don't make me go nuclear." Going nuclear was our code for telling Mom. Yellow just looked at me and said, "Fine, just don't call me crazy." I nodded in agreement. I was intrigued, though I was expecting a lie from my known liar of a sister. Me and Brown saw a bunch of weird, large tents, and they were occupied. She sounded excited, yet a bit scared. I didn't think much of it at first. I mean, people like to camp, right? But I will admit, the area she described didn't sound like a good place to camp. Coyotes and snakes everywhere. "So you saw some people camping. What of it?" Brown shook her head and calmly said, "Not camping tents. Big, big tents. Not a single vehicle parked nearby." I was now confused, and started to think that it was a lie. Who would go that far out near the mountains, set up huge tents, then drive away? "I thought you said there were people there?" I asked. "We saw one person walking around the camp, circling it slowly," Yellow replied. Then Brown's face went pale and annoyed before she spoke. "Yeah, then Yellow did something stupid and shouted at the camp." I quickly looked at Yellow, who looked guilty but simply laughed it off. "All I did was say, 'Hey, nice tent. No big deal.'" Brown shook her head. "Yeah, but then the guy stopped and slowly turned to where we were." She went quiet and they both started to visibly get creeped out. "And?" I asked, starting to get a creepy vibe as well. "I kid you not, Blue. This guy had no eyes or a nose. Just a big, crooked smile." Brown shuddered, and then said that this was the moment when they ran without a thought, hearing a coyote howling constantly as they ran, as if the animal was directly behind them. I told them not to go near there again, and they went about their night. Like I said, Yellow is a known liar, but Brown is not. Brown is the exact opposite of Yellow, honor student, religious, and not a bad bone in her body. She would even rat on Yellow whenever she tried lying around her. To be honest, if Brown wasn't with Yellow when this happened, I wouldn't have believed it. That night I swore I saw the same SUV drive by our house every single hour until the sun came up. After that night, things started getting weird in this town. About 3 days later, the house across from us echoed a blood-curdling scream, and it didn't sound human at all. Then there was a gunshot, and if it wasn't for the neighbors also hearing it, I would have thought I dreamt it. The thing is, multiple people heard the noises, and multiple times the police were called. No one showed. The next morning, the lady who lived in the house started moving her stuff into her van, but her boyfriend was nowhere in sight, which I thought was strange because those two were inseparable. They were the perfect college couple, plus they had just moved in. I talked to my neighbor about it while she was loading everything, and he told me that he had called the cops when he heard the gunshot, and what he told me freaked me out. Here's the conversation that he had with the 911 operator. Operator: "Police will be there in no more than 5 minutes, sir." Neighbor: "Thank you." Operator hangs up abruptly. 12 minutes pass. He sees 0 police in our area or at the house, calls again. Operator: 911, what is the emergency? Neighbor: "Yeah, I just called, gunshot and scream. I was told 5 minutes, and no one is here." The operator was silent. My neighbor said, "Hello?" Operator: "Yes, sir. I have officers pulling into your area in 2 minutes. Neighbor: "Okay, I'm gonna stay on the..." Hangs up again. Line. 15 minutes later and still no police. He calls again. Operator. 911, what's your emergency? Neighbor. Yeah, it's me again. Where are the officers? Someone might be in danger. Operator. Sir, calm down. What's your address? Neighbor. I have given it each time I've called, but fine. Gives address again. Operator. Sir, the police are there, and have been for 20 minutes now. Neighbor. No, I'm looking at the road and all the houses. No cops. Operator. Sir, stop prank calling. Hangs up. Now I thought that was just bizarre and unsettling thinking about our lack of police. But just as he finished with the story, a car pulls in and slowly heads to the house. It was the same SUV that I saw, and not only that, but it was a police SUV. It didn't even stop. It just slowed down by each house and then slowly drove by the college girl loading her stuff up. She froze and stared at the cop car, and only continued when it left. I had enough, so I went over to ask if she needed any help loading things into her car, and she said yes. I started putting boxes in from the garage. I saw a poster of Sauron in one of the boxes, so we started talking about our shared love and obsession for Lord of the Rings. Then I asked where her boyfriend was, and she said, gone, without hesitation. I didn't push it. Once I had the last box in, I asked her if she had any more inside. She quickly jumped between me and the door inside and said, no, thank you, but that's all I have. I smiled and said, no worries, glad to be of help. I forced a calm, relaxed expression when I saw that her garage door leading inside was DIY locked from the outside. She got into her car and stared ahead, and all she said to me was, don't trust the police, don't trust the TV, and don't trust the animals. I felt a shiver run up my spine and quietly asked, what do you mean? She started her car and simply said, stay away from the mountain. She drove away and closed the garage as she went. I walked back to my house, and even as I write this, no one comes in or out of that house. In between then and last night, our neighborhood has been infested with coyotes, though not a single one has been seen. Strange police behavior, a strange accumulation of crows and helicopters that only ever come by at night, circling my neighborhood. But on to last night. Yellow's cat got out, and we were looking for him. We exhausted everywhere except the desert. Yellow wanted to go, but these few weeks have been creepy and stressful, and we're both small girls. So I agreed, but we were gonna go prepared. Me and Yellow went back home and got flashlights, backup batteries, 2 knives each, and my metal baseball bat. Yellow's boyfriend Green tagged along, which made me feel safer because he is tall and is the captain of the wrestling team. He brought a stun gun after we told him why we were prepared for the worst. So me, Yellow, and Brown went into the desert and searched for her cat. The entire time I couldn't stop staring at the mountain in the distance. After everything that has been going on, being in this area scared the living crap out of me. That is when we heard the meowing in the distance. It definitely sounded like Yellow's cat. The only issue is that it was coming from the direction of the creepy mountain. Yellow started to go in that direction. Green and I followed soon after. Yellow said something that I already assumed, but wish was wrong. This is towards where me and Brown saw the tents. I started thinking the worst. We're gonna get killed, or we're gonna get sold into trafficking. My thoughts were going crazy, and my anxiety shot through the roof. That's when Green looked through his binoculars and said that he saw the tent. I quickly snatched them away and looked, and sure enough, 3 big military tents, and not far behind it was the mountain. If it wasn't for the lights in the camp, I wouldn't be able to see anything in the dark. I examined as much as I could. I didn't see a man circling, though I did see what looked to be a military truck pulling in, then 4 soldier-looking people hopped into the truck, and it went toward the mountain. The 3 of us just watched in the quiet and practically jumped to Mars when we heard a meow behind us. Sure enough, Yellow's cat was right there, happy and purring. We all collectively laughed at how silly we were, and then we picked up the cat and calmly went back home. On our way, we joked at how we had just stumbled on a military post, nothing else. We got home and the cat went and stared out the back door into the dark backyard, which I thought was weird, but then again, it's a cat and they do weird stuff all the time. I woke up to my mom yelling. Apparently, someone had gotten into the fridge and eaten tonight's dinner. She said it was an animal, but my dogs were in my room with me, so she assumed that it was the cat. Yellow shrugged it off and cleaned it up. But the weirdest thing was that it did look like the cat did it, as there was clumps of raw meat in his fur and around his mouth. But it looked like a bear had gotten into our fridge, and that the cat had just continued to stare out the window, only stopping about a few hours ago and sleeping. I got curious, and decided to walk out into the desert while it was day out. Safe, right? Well, that's what I thought, and I was wrong. I went with that baseball bat and Green's binoculars and followed the exact same path, and you probably guessed it. Not a single tent or sign of anything, but there was a coyote just sitting where the tents had been. It was staring up at me with strange eyes and a crooked face. I heard it howl, but I didn't see it howl. I took a step back, and it stepped forward. Then I booked it. I didn't want to be that dumb white girl in the horror movie who lingers around and gets killed, but running seemed like a scarier option. I sprinted all the way home with the sounds of growling and howling directly in my ear. I swear I could feel the breath on the back of my neck, but I never turned around. If I was gonna die, I was gonna die looking forward. As soon as I hit gravel, the noise stopped, and for whatever reason I immediately turned around, ready to swing with my bat, and all I saw was the back of a man walking back to the mountain with his hands in his long black trench coat. From behind I could see that he was bald, and wore jet black sunglasses. His skin was pale as snow, and he wore a fedora-like hat on his head. I stared at him until he was gone, and not once did he turn around. I'm home now, more confused, more creeped out than anything else. I think I might investigate further, but I don't know. I can't get this experience out of my head, no matter how many years have passed. This happened way back in the early 2000s. I was in the 8th grade and we were on a trip. I stayed in a hotel with 2 other girls. One of them was my friend and another girl who we were just somewhat acquainted with. The first night in the room, during my shower, I felt like someone was behind me, like standing really close to my back under the shower spray. I turned around quickly, but no one was there. So I continued showering, but the feeling just got worse. When I finished my shower, I pulled open the curtain, and when I looked up at the gigantic wall mirror, I saw a grotesque face behind my right shoulder. It was gone within seconds. I think I stood frozen there for a whole minute before I practically ran out, screaming. The next day, we were getting ready to go out. The girl we roomed with said that someone was in our room last night. She heard the toilet flush, the sink turn on, but then nothing. No one entered the room. No one left. And no one else but us was in there to begin with. We know because we checked every nook and cranny after she told us. The second night, when we got back to our hotel room, I suddenly felt super sleepy, like I literally fell to the floor once I stepped inside. It was odd because I wasn't sleepy at all until we actually walked into the room. The other 2 couldn't move me since I had an extra 50 pounds on them, so they just covered me up with the blanket, put a pillow under my head, and left me there. Then my friend said that sometime during the night I had gotten up, used the bathroom, and crawled into the bed. But I don't remember doing that. In fact, when I woke up on the 3rd day, I was still on the floor. I work at the front desk of a hotel, and within the last 6 months, we had a guest that passed away in one of our rooms. Because of this pandemic, my boss has blocked off the room, even after deep cleaning, just to be safe. Due to the hotel business not doing well, he also had a couple of rooms cut off from power, which means that none of the electronics are working for those rooms. Now, our hotel has 2 phones up at the front, one for external calls and the other specifically for internal lines, which are only connected to the phones in each guest room. I was having a quiet day during my shift alone. Business isn't running as normal, and all the housekeepers had left for the day, and the only staff there was the maintenance guy and I. I get an internal phone call from one of the rooms and answer it as I usually do, and it's just static noises, along with an occasional cut-in between, like the noise that you get when you unplug your headphones from a device. I didn't think anything of it at first, and thought that it was a guest accidentally calling the front desk, so I waited a little bit to hang up. Then I realized that the call was from the same room where the guest had passed away, and that there was no way a call could be made from that room because the phone was unplugged. I was a little bit spooked, so I asked the maintenance guy, who was just chilling in the back office, to go and check out the room and make sure that the power was still out. He comes back and sure enough the phone is still unplugged, and he even took a picture of it. He also has a log of what rooms have power, electronics, etc. We even checked the lobby cameras to make sure that no one had gone into the rooms, and there was nothing. No housekeepers went in or out of the room at all within the past week. Just as we were done checking the camera footage, I received another call from that same exact room. And this time it was silent for a good 10 seconds or so, and then the same static noise, but this time much louder. I hung up the phone so fast, a guest asked if everything was okay. I didn't tell her. I tried to think of every scientific possible way that this could have been an internal mistake, such as an outside sales call accidentally getting caught within our internal call system, but that's just impossible to begin with, especially if the phone cord was not plugged in. I was riding my bike down a long road with almost 0 vehicles on it. I was in the dedicated bike lane, scooting along as I'd done hundreds of times before down this stretch of road. There's about 3 feet of opening gap between the curb of this road and the bike lane, followed by a 3-foot wide bike lane, and then finally the vehicle lane. Vehicles are not allowed to park in the gap or bike lane unless they're the city maintenance vehicle crews. Vehicles are not allowed to park in the gap or the bike lane unless they're the city maintenance crews that service the road, grass, and noise walls of this particular stretch. Well, this day there was a big blue moving truck parked right on the curb, wide enough to take up the empty 3-foot gap and the 3-foot wide bike lane and spill over into the vehicle lane. I thought, no big deal, as there weren't any cars behind me and I had plenty of space to move into the road to go around it. The spot where the truck was stopped was the only spot on the stretch of road where the shrubbery from the other side of the noise wall was growing into the ground and out the other side. It sticks out like a sore thumb. But anyway, as I was going around the truck and into the vehicle lane, the door to the cab of the truck flew open forcefully right as I was about to pass it. I'm talking like the person that threw it open was trying their best to hurt me and waited for the best opportunity. At the last second, I clenched my teeth, swerved out of the way, and just instinctively swerved back into the bike lane and came to a stop. Angry and full of adrenaline, I screamed at them what was their problem, that they could have killed me, while dismounting my bike and making my way to the truck. This is where it got strange. There was no one inside the truck itself. I went back toward it, and there was no one outside of the truck either. It was really just there, with the door still wide open. There was nowhere anyone could have slipped away to. The noise walls are there to spare the neighboring homes from car noises, and they're about 10 feet tall, and they stretch out for a good quarter mile, with no open gaps anywhere. I went around to the back of the truck, and it was open and empty. Nothing in it, no hiding spots. Just an empty truck and an empty cab. I decided to just jump on my bike and go home. I pushed it out of my head and considered myself lucky to be unharmed. That lasted about a day. I can't help but feel like I was in some moment in time that somehow got stuck. Upon remembering the occurrence, there was almost no sound. No other cars driving by, no birds chirping, no wind blowing on what was actually a fairly windy day. It wasn't until I got closer to my home that everything felt normal again, and I was able to move past it. Now it plagues me that I didn't take a photo with my phone or didn't look for one of those "how's my driving" stickers to report the truck. It's one of those glitches that I'm just gonna have to wonder about forever. This happened around 2006 or 7. There is this guy. I'll call him Dean here, who's widely known in my small village. Dean was a drug addict, but managed somehow to work and build a family. But his addiction got worse, and eventually I got the news that he died in a mixed drugs overdose. We, friends and my then boyfriend, talked on a few different occasions about his death, how it was somehow foreseeable that he would die, and so on. Not long after he passed, like 2 months, I had just opened our pub at 4 p.m. and Dean walks in. He didn't look great, but he also didn't look dead. He noticed my facial expression and got slightly pissed as to why I was looking at him in such a way, so I quickly shook it off and served him. Later that evening when my boyfriend arrived, I asked him what was going on with Dean, that he should be 6 feet under, but he said that he had no knowledge about Dean being dead, or that we had had talks about it. I asked them if maybe I confused him with someone else's death who we all knew and we were talking about, but they denied having knowledge of someone else's death. Funny part is that after this happened, Dean got rid of his addiction and got his shit together. A glitch which happened earlier, around 2004, where my same as above boyfriend and best friend and I went to Berlin for 3 days. We rented a room for 3 in a little lo-fi hotel. So the first evening, it was Friday, we went out and looked for a location to have a good time. Locals guided us to a known party street where usually a lot of people were out, but for some unknown reason, nothing was going on that night at all. Only a few people were there. We still decided to bar hop and have a good time, just us 3. We drank a lot of tequila and water, and after we got kicked out of a bar, only for the reason that the owner disliked our nationality, we left this street and walked up to a kebab where we ate and drank even more, and then decided to head towards our hotel. We did, and the next thing I clearly remember was that we entered a really tiny, cozy bar which was plastered in red velvet and had all dimmed down lights. I think even the carpeting was velvet. We had funny talks with the older locals, men and women, inside, and they were thrilled about our language when we talked to each other. At one point, I felt too drunk and said to my companions that I wanted to go to bed. They felt the same, and we left. I then literally stormed away along this street, thinking our hotel was about 1 kilometer or so away, and I wanted to hurry. But after I went like this for about 20 meters, my companions yelled after me so that I would come back, because our hotel seemed to be right next door to that bar. Really, really next. Like next in the way of the bar door and the hotel door were about 20 centimeters away from each other. We didn't notice the bar when we arrived, and when we left the hotel earlier that day. Well confused, we went in and slept. The next day at noon, when we went out, there was no bar at all next to our hotel. Not even its door. And it didn't show up the following night either. We are still talking about this, and at least this time my friend and former boyfriend seem to remember the same things. I've had a few unexplained experiences over the decades, but the Gold Hill Hotel is my favorite spooky tale. I was staying the weekend at the hotel with friends and my then boyfriend. It was a really memorable weekend because it was the Christmas holiday season and the hotel was decked out. We were all drinking and it was quite festive. There was a female jazz singer from San Francisco who was staying at the hotel and who played carols on the piano. My boyfriend went up to the room before me and passed out drunk in the bed. I followed not long after. Later that night, I awoke suddenly to someone jerking the blankets off of me. It was the force of the jerk on the blankets that woke me up. I immediately looked over at my snoring, drunk boyfriend sleeping on his side, and then down at the blankets themselves. They had been pulled down to my waist, and down off of him. I slowly pulled them back up and curled up next to him. I slept very little the rest of the night. The next day, I asked him if he recalled anything unusual, but he didn't, and poo-pooed my experience. Later, I found out that we were staying in one of the rooms that visitors commonly reported having blankets pulled off of them. I can't recall the specifics of the ghost that actually haunts the room, but I sure do remember that moment when the blankets were laying down below my waist and pulled off of my boyfriend, and realizing that maybe we weren't alone in our room. The desert is a scary place for me now. It used to be a place filled with peace and serenity, but since living out there for almost 30 years, you see things. This occurrence took place in the high desert of California in the early 1990s. The whole town was once all military. There's a military plant there and a prison, and the streets to this day consist of numbers and letters, for example, Avenue O and 178th Street. You always heard stories of people missing and underground tunnels, confirmed. In fact, a friend of mine kept getting a draft coming from his closet in his childhood home. Later, after he grew up, he checked it out and found an opening to one of these such tunnels. He called me over to check it out, but after I got there and we went through the opening, I was too freaked out to go more than 10 feet in when I turned around and told him that this might be how people disappear. You always saw things late at night, off in the distance far past the lights of that then small town. Strange, glowing, different colored lights that would move around low or zigzag, then shoot straight up. We saw things in the sky, just stuff you never talked about. Life was pretty carefree back then. If you wanted to visit friends, though, you would have to drive down long desert roads and sometimes end up coming home late at night in the pitch black because there were no street lights. I recall coming home late one such night with my boyfriend at the time and another friend, and we pulled over for some reason. Something compelled me to get out of the car and look up at the stars. We were in the middle of nowhere, but we could hear what sounded like machinery and muffled clanks like metal. We all started looking around but didn't see anything. Just then, we felt a vibration under our feet. I crouched down on the street to put my ear to the ground. It was coming from under us. We all listened intently and heard far down voices, but couldn't make out what was being said. We stood up and were discussing what it might have been when we saw a small red light on the horizon and it was getting closer. We piled into the car and got out of Dodge. We only told a few friends, and they said that they had experienced the same thing. A year later, I told a friend that I started a small hauling business. Still, there was a big job, so I needed to borrow a trailer. He said he had a few that I could use, so I should come out to his property to check them out. It was just starting to get dark when he pulled out his new toy. It was a pair of military-grade night vision binoculars. He told me to wait until it got dark to leave, because he wanted to show me something creepy, and I was all in. Later we walked towards the back of his property, looking out at nothing, no lights, no roads, nothing but a barren desert. He pointed the binoculars east, and oh my. There were people coming out of the ground and moving around. I said, "What the hell am I looking at?" And he told me that his family called them ground dwellers, and that they are located in various parts of the desert. It gave me the heebie-jeebies. Needless to say, I never went to his house after dark again. At one point in my life, I lived in a mobile home park, a little past Avenue F. There was a massive treehouse in my yard that was left by a former tenant. The only way to get up into it was through a hole cut in the floor with a door on it, and under that was a rope ladder. One night I was sitting on the porch drinking a cup of tea when I heard something move up in the treehouse, and then a head popped up. It was a lady and her husband hiding. Clearly, I thought they were on drugs. I told them to come down from there, but they both refused. It wasn't until I threatened to call the authorities did they cautiously comply, looking all around, not wanting to be seen. By now, there's a small group of my friends and nosy neighbors gathering around. I saw that she was terrified by something, so I asked them to come in. I made them something to eat and waited for her to calm down. Then the lady reached in her bag and pulled out some papers. They looked like legal documents with government letterhead. There were drawings and schematics, and some of them even had embossed seals. I couldn't help but notice that they had water and smoke damage, and a few of them were burnt on the edges. She told me that they were checking out this place off of Barrel Springs Road, where there were 2 or 3 cinder block structures. I knew them well. A few years back I happened upon that place, and a black truck rushed down to greet me with guns drawn. She said the same thing happened to her, but she was in one of the structures, so she grabbed some things, and she and her husband ran. I went over these pages, and felt very uneasy reading them, like this was stuff that people get killed over if it got out. Stupidly, I said, "Why don't you just simply give them back?" She said that they had been running, and everywhere they stop a black car or van with government or no plates showed up with darkened windows and would just sit there watching them. Well, I really didn't want to get too involved, especially after reading what I did think was way too big for a little ol' me. I will take what I saw to my death, so I packed them lunch and told them that they could sleep in the treehouse for the night. They did, but they were gone early the next morning before I woke up. After that, we started seeing black vans parked on our lonely road, facing the house. At one point, I even walked up to them, but they took off as soon as I knocked on their blacked-out driver's door window. Lots of unexplained things happened out there in the desert that you don't see much of now. I think because there are more lights and people, well-lit towns, and camera phones pointing everywhere. There weren't cell phones to call for help back then. I remember one time a few years later, it was a fun day with some of my friends. We were in this stupid little red car called a Yugo that seemed to be on its last leg most of the time. My friend's uncle told him that there was a whole abandoned town far west of the Mojave Desert, and that there were things just left there all over the place. We were so dumb. It took us a long time to get out there, and if you asked me to try and find out how now, I don't know if I could. I wasn't driving. Thinking we were lost a few times, we started seeing things. A carnival ticket booth on a trailer, broken tractors and furniture, little shacks here and there, and empty water bottles all over the place. There wasn't a livable house or store or place of business for many, many miles. I wondered how anyone could even survive in a place like this, and then we saw it. It was a long and looked like single-wide mobile home, if you could ever call it home. It was between 60 to 50 feet long, and it was raised with the siding going all the way to the ground. It looked like something from a horror movie. It had several windows down the length of the house. Some of the windows had old frayed curtains still hung up and blowing in the desert breeze. There were open sections of missing siding, exposing the darkness underneath the structure big enough to step or crawl through. There were old, dusty cars with their doors and trunks open, trash and open cans all over, and a small fire pit in the middle of all of this. His girlfriend and I saw people that seemed to not be wearing any clothes that we could make out, but their bodies were skinny and didn't move like ours. They were inside that house and were watching us from the windows and from the open spaces underneath. They were following us, and as we slowly drove past, they went from window to window and open space to open space underneath. They were almost inhuman, and had big eyes and pale skin. Too pale for the desert. My friend the driver pulled up next to the fire pit, and despite us screaming to go, 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 he turned off the car. His girlfriend began to cry out that we had to leave then and now. He didn't see what we saw. He said, "Stop, babe, this stuff is so cool." Oh my god, I wanted to punch him in the face. We both kept looking at the people watching us while begging him to get back in the car and drive. He picked up a long bone off the ground and started to push the soot around the fire pit and said, "Hey, it looks like somebody cooked a dog." Just then he looked up. His girlfriend leaned over to the driver's seat and grabbed his jacket in an attempt to pull him back into the car when he finally saw what we were seeing and said, "Oh shit." That thing hiding under the house was swaying back and forth. His hands were on both sides of the opening, and he was staring at us almost with the intent to lunge. He tried to start the car, but it failed. Thinking that this was my end, that I was about to be eaten in the desert, I began to beat on the back of his seat, screaming, "Please, God, start." After 3 tries, it finally did. We tore out of there, leaving a huge cloud of dust. We pulled over far from that location and tried to compose ourselves. Never again. We didn't talk about what we saw after that. I think that we were in disbelief that it had even happened. There were so many crazy things that occurred in the desert back in those days. Too many to even come close to tell you. I know that there are things that we do not, or maybe will never, understand. I also know that there are more eyes now paying attention, so I don't think it will be too much longer before we all know the truth. My family and I moved into a new house. It used to have an attic, but it's been sealed off. After a couple of months into living in this house, sometimes I'm just watching TV and I hear scratching from the roof. I just play it off as a bird, as they're common where I live. After 3 weeks, the scratching has gotten worse and more frequent. It's like it's trying to scratch its way out of the roof. By the way, the attic entrance thing is above the outside of my sister's room. One day my sister tells my dad that the seal is open. My dad gets confused because it was supposed to be sealed off completely. My dad goes to close it and realizes that it's really hard to open and close, so whatever opened it was strong. That's when I start to get skeptical. The same night I go to get some snacks from the fridge, I open it to find out that they are all gone. I thought my siblings must have eaten them. In the morning, my parents are going on about a missing cake. The cake was supposed to be for my niece's birthday. They asked if I had anything to do with it, and I said no, along with all my other siblings. I was getting really suspicious about the attic, so I built up the courage to go and check it out. Note that I am probably the most paranoid person in the world, so I was scared for my life. But my curiosity got the best of me. I get the ladder, a torch, and a knife, just in case. I open the entrance. I shine my torch to see nothing. But as I search more, I see the cake, empty snack packets, dirty clothes, and a short, dark silhouette. It just freezes in place. Immediately I bolt and scream for my parents and tell them everything. They tell me to stay in my room. They go up and check, but there was no one there. I'm still shaken from that moment and get nightmares from it. We have since moved from that home and now live a normal, non-scary life. I haven't posted this here before, but I have commented about this incident in other posts. But having recently found this subreddit, I think it definitely fits in here. It was a couple of years ago. I was visiting my parents who still live in the same house that I grew up in. The day I came home, Mum told me that my old school bus driver had passed away the day before. I'd been very fond of him and would often bump into him before I had moved out of that town, as he lived in the same neighborhood as ours. So when Mum told me about his passing away, it was a heart attack, she said, I was quite upset, and I distinctly remember every detail about the conversation that I had with my mum about this. Later that evening, when I was out on a run, I noticed a little blue flyer by the park with his photograph and details of the funeral and a prayer meeting. A couple of days later, I was out buying groceries from the market, when I saw him standing outside a shop, looking very much alive. I was confused AF, and wondered if he had a twin brother. Either way, I didn't stop to chat. Later at home, when I told my mom what happened, she looked really confused and said that she never told me that he had died. I was naturally annoyed and tried to help her recall the conversation and told her about the flyer at the park. She asked me if I was okay, 'cause she was sure as hell that she did not say any such thing about his death. So I go out to walk by the park to see if the flyer is still there, and it wasn't. I was extremely confused by this point, but having no logical explanation to offer, I decided to dismiss it. Not for long, though. A few days later, my holiday had come to an end, and I had returned back to the city where I work. Exactly a day later, I get a call from my mom saying that my bus driver had passed away that morning, and that it had been a heart attack. I couldn't believe it, and I figured that my mom was a bit freaked out too, 'cause she sounded a bit shaky. Not knowing what else to say, I asked her to check if a blue flyer with details of his funeral and prayer meetings was up at the park, whenever she could step out for a walk. Later that evening, she confirmed that there was a blue flyer with those details and his picture. Mom dismissed it as a coincidence and has never spoken of this incident again. Whenever I have tried to remind her, she says she doesn't recall all the details. But I know it's not true, and that she does remember this. It's just so freaky, and I get the chills every time I think about it. I just haven't been able to explain what happened. I have always been interested in the paranormal and going ghost hunting, as me and my friends called it. This story takes place on an October night in 2005. We had gathered at my dad's house for a party. We lived way out in the country in an old farmhouse. We decided to drive up the road to an old cemetery because one of my friends showed up with a Ouija board. I said we weren't going to use it at my house, but I was game to use it somewhere else. About 6 of us piled into different vehicles and took off. When we got there, we set the Ouija board up on an old concrete barrier that surrounded the entrance of the cemetery. For context, the cemetery was set on a hill surrounded by cow pastures, fields, and trees. Across the road stood an old, white church. There were 2 security lights that lit the church area and the entrance to the cemetery. There was one more security light that lit the field next to the only house for about 2 miles. We all stood in a circle, planchette in the centers, hands all on it. My friend led the seance and asked if there was anything in the cemetery with us. At first nothing happened and we all stood still and quiet. Then the planchette slowly moved toward yes. Immediately we all started accusing each other of moving it, but everyone swore that they didn't. An eerie feeling fell over us as the planchette moved back to the center of the board. About that time, we heard what sounded like wind initially, but began to get closer. It sounded like the footsteps of multiple people running in circles all around us. We were all wide-eyed, looking at each other when someone said, "I'm out." Another person said, "We have to tell it bye or the spirits will follow." The leader of the group spoke to the board and said something along the lines of, "We are saying goodbye to you," and the planchette quickly jerked to no. It was pretty obvious by how shocked we all were that none of us had done that. Mind you, the sound of the footsteps are still surrounding us. The planchette moves to the center and we say bye again. Again, it moves to no, then back to the center. This time we all say it together, my friend's idea, and slowly, agonizingly slowly, moved the planchette to the word goodbye. We were relieved and took off running to the cars, which were parked at the entrance of the cemetery on the side of the road. Me and a buddy jump into my truck, and I hear my friend scream something about not being able to find their keys. She checks the ignition, her pockets. All our friends check the car and their pockets. No keys. Everyone else loads back into the truck, and we speed the 3 miles down the road to my dad's house. My friend searches her purse and pockets for the keys again, and again we couldn't find them anywhere. Eventually, someone takes her home, and she says she'll get her spare and get a ride back to her car in the morning. We were all too scared to go back and look that night. The next day, my friend searches the cemetery and never finds the keys, even in broad daylight. We hadn't walked around a whole lot, and where we used the Ouija board was very close to where we had parked our cars. Me and several friends scoured the entire cemetery over the next week or so and never did find them. My friend said she was 100% positive that they were left in the ignition when she got out of the car. It's where I left mine, and a common practice in the area where I'm from, which, like I said, is pretty rural. This was by far my scariest, but not the only, Ouija board experience that I have. In 2001, I was big into ghost hunting. I was looking online for a haunted weekend road trip destination and came across the Jefferson Hotel in Jefferson, Texas. About the only thing it said was that room 19 was quote-unquote uninhabitable. Now that really piqued my interest, so I called them up and asked if it was true. The lady at the front desk laughed and just said no, we book that room all the time. So I reserved it. I was so excited, but didn't really think that anything would happen. I'd been to several supposedly haunted hotels and B&Bs and had no results. Now, I'm not sensitive like some people. I always hear people say, "I felt like someone was watching me." I have no idea what that means. The only thing I noticed when I walked in the room was a faint, musky smell of an old-fashioned perfume. I set up a recorder in the room and headed out to explore the town. It was like going back in time. If you live in Texas and are looking for a road trip, I highly recommend Jefferson. When I got back to the room, I turned off the recorder and looked out its one window to see a large bust of Thomas Jefferson in the courtyard. I then sat down on the bed to relax and watch some TV. After a bit, something caused me to look back up at the window, and I saw something. A red smudge on the glass. I frowned and got up to see what it was. I hadn't noticed any red smudges earlier. I looked closely. It was more like a streak of red in a greasy substance of some sort. Then I noticed more streaks, and then more. I gradually began to realize that these were letters. My heart began to race as I backed up to take it all in. These streaks of red were spelling out, "Help me." I kind of just collapsed on the bed, my heart still racing. I knew without a doubt in my mind that those letters were not there 15 minutes earlier. I just sat in disbelief for about 5 minutes. Needless to say, there was not much sleep to be had that night. As I left the hotel the next morning, I was disappointed to see that there was no one behind the desk. I really needed to talk to someone. I left a note about the writing and said that I would call them on Monday. When I called, I told the woman who answered who I was, and she said, "Hold on just a moment." She put the housekeeping lady on the phone. I asked, "Did you see it?" She said, "Yes, I saw it." And then she said, "Just before you arrived, I raised the blinds and turned on the AC. There was no writing. And the strangest thing was when I attempted to clean it off. She said that it was like the letters had been engraved into the glass." I told her that I was freaked out, and she confirmed that she was too. By the way, on the way home I listened to the tape that I had had running in the room while I was gone. What I heard was the sound of the closet door angrily slamming several times and something shuffling around. But what really got to me was the sound of a woman sobbing. I'm from Norway, and I'm fortunate to travel a lot. During my travels, I've seen the same dad and son on 3 different occasions, 3 different continents, in 3 different decades. And they looked exactly the same each time. So the first time I saw them was in New York, back in 1999. I took an escalator in a mall near Times Square. I was going down, they were going up. All 3 of us stared at each other until I reached the bottom, and they, the top. Fast forward to 2009. I'm in Rome with my family, and in a new mall, new escalator. I see them again. They look exactly the same, and I realized that I had seen them before. And we do the same thing. Stare until I reach the bottom, and they, the top. Fast forward again, this time to Dubai in 2019. I'm at the Dubai Mall, and you guessed it. There they are. This time it looked like they recognized me too. They just stared at me different, like they didn't want me to see them. They both looked very serious and almost angry. This time I felt super uncomfortable because I immediately recognized them. And this is 20 years after I saw them the first time, which raises a few questions. First of all, why do I keep seeing them in the exact same situation? Why don't they age? Is it just a coincidence? Why always on the escalator? And why do they stare at me until I'm out of sight? The weird thing is that in the malls I've seen them in, you usually walk around for a few hours, but I've never seen them anywhere else besides the escalator. Also, the son looks to be around 14 or 15. That's why it's so easy to see that they hadn't aged a bit. Kid was still 14 or 15, 20 years later. A few years ago, my best friend Jay and I decided to start exploring in the desert near a tiny statutory town close to our hometown with an immense expanse of land and an adjoining wild horse preserve. We were hooked immediately, both of us people who enjoy hiking and camping. This place seemed like heaven. It wasn't long before we found an amazing little campsite about 15 miles or so into the desert, far away from any light pollution and even cell phone signal. It's the perfect place with a small reservoir used in the late summer to water free-range cattle, an old corral, and a fire pit carved into the sandstone. We decided we needed to go camping as soon as possible, and planned on having our first camping trip a few days later on my days off. Jay and his SO met me out there with our dogs, and the first day was a ton of fun playing around the book cliffs high above the Grand Junction and sighting wild horses. We returned to camp late in the afternoon, and had a nice time cooking dinner and telling stories around the campfire. Soon darkness fell, and I began to become aware that I had been feeling uneasy. Not wanting to ruin the fun for my friends, I told them I was tired and needed to turn in. I returned to my tent with my 2 dogs and snuggled in, the feeling of unease tightening around my shoulders. I couldn't shake the feeling of anxiety, so I did what I do best and chose to ignore it, turning on a movie that I'd downloaded on my laptop. As the intro played to my movie, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I paused the film and stared behind me. I saw what looked like the bobbing of a flashlight behind our camp near the dirt road. The light danced for a few minutes before disappearing. I looked beside me and saw that my dogs were still sleeping peacefully and chalked it up to my imagination before returning to my movie. I must have fallen asleep because it wasn't long before Jay's SO was waking me up and asking me to come help calm Jay down. When I left my tent, my friend was visibly upset and shaken. He kept apologizing and asking if we could leave. He said he didn't know what was wrong, but that he needed to leave, that we needed to leave now. I told him that I'd been feeling incredibly uneasy and watched all night, and we agreed to go. Taking only our dogs and pillows, we left our campsite and drove the long 30 miles back home in the middle of the night. The drive back into the town was nerve-wracking. I had to keep glancing in the rearview mirror to make sure that my friend's car was still behind me. It took everything I had to keep my vehicle under 20 miles an hour so that I wouldn't ruin my car on the heavily rutted dirt roads, but it felt as though we were being chased away. The next day, Jay decided to go back for our things. Both his SO and I had to work that day, so he drove out to the campsite in the early afternoon. Everything was as it should be. No animals had touched our stuff or even tried to get into the cooler. But he said that he still felt watched, and as if something wasn't right. A few weeks later, a friend of Jay's was in town visiting and wanted to go camping, so Jay took him back to the spot near the reservoir. He said he experienced the same feeling laying there in his tent, his whole body screaming out in anxiety. He said all of his muscles were tense, and he had the overwhelming feeling that if he were to close his eyes, that something horrible would happen. So he left his tent, not wanting to wake his friend, and decided to take a stroll around the campsite. Before long, he found himself down by the reservoir. This is when he saw a small but brightly intense light darting and dancing back and forth, tucked into the valley below the Grand Mesa, going from east to west. It darted and whirled around. He said the feeling of fear and unease was so intense that he went back to his tent without watching to see if the light went away. We have both had a handful of odd experiences out there following these incidents. I've taken several friends and family members out there to experience the beauty. One summer I was seeing a guy who was interested in checking out the area, so I took him to a spot where we could park my car and explore near the Twin Peaks. We started walking up an oil field admin road when I was overcome with the urge to climb up the sandstone rockfall at the base of the mountain. My friend followed me, and we hiked up until he found an opening to a cave. We peered in and found that the opening was more like a skylight. The bottom was a good 20 feet or so below us. We decided to look around and see if there was an actual entrance. After a bit of searching, we followed my dog to the entrance of the cave. It was low and slightly blocked off by fallen sandstones, so we had to get on our backs and inch in foot first. When we got in, we saw that we were only in a smaller antechamber, but the smell of something decaying and the feeling of unease we felt told us to leave, so we did. It was only after we got back into the car that I discovered I dropped my favorite vape. It's been 2 years since I lost it, but every time I'm around there, I have the overwhelming urge to return. On one occasion, my mom and I took our dogs out to the desert to run free. I took her to a cool rock outcropping that I call Castle Rock. We hiked up the rock structure and started to make our way around it when we noticed the base of this rock structure was littered with small bones of every variety. This creeped my mom out heavily, but I am sort of a goblin by nature, so I started picking through them for things to take home. My mom told me she didn't feel right, and wanted to walk back down to the Jeep. I told her to please hold on a minute, that I'd been wanting to check this place out, so she stayed while I hiked up the right side of the structure. I found some cool rocks, took some pictures, and enjoyed the view from the top of the rocks before heading down. When I got back to my mom, she was extremely upset, saying that she had been yelling for me the whole time and that she couldn't find me anywhere. I laughed her off and told her that I was thirsty, so we returned to her Jeep. As soon as we got in, we noticed a volleyball in front of her vehicle. It was maybe 3 feet in front of her Jeep right where we had walked past, with no footprints or any indication as to how it had gotten there. There have been several other strange occurrences, but nothing ever really seems to happen. Only eerie feelings, occasional lights, and the sensation that someone is watching you. But I always manage to convince myself that there really isn't anything going on, besides an overactive imagination, and I always return. I'm incredibly drawn to the area, like nothing I've ever experienced before. I've even taken a couple of solo camping trips despite being a single female by myself. But I always return, even after promising my best friend and my sister that I wouldn't go out there alone anymore. I always do. Jay refuses to go camping out there anymore, and it takes a great deal of effort to convince him to go explore anymore. Despite the fact that he has hitchhiked from Michigan to Colorado, done solo backpacking and more, he can't stand it. Beside the feeling of being watched when I'm out there, the fixation bordering on obsession with this place kind of makes me nervous. I always feel like I'm searching for something when I'm out there, leading me to go to new places and check out new areas. I am on an extended stay at a hotel away from my home for military reasons. The first 2 weeks were fine, but now I've been waking up between 4 and 5 a.m. every night, feeling like someone is watching me from one specific side of the room. Last night it started around 10 p.m. and nearly kept me up all night. I only feel this at my hotel room, not when I go home on my off-duty days. I live on the second floor, so it can't be coming from the window. It is only one specific side of the room, which is a little unsettling. Last night it got so intense that what little sleep that I did get was with the light on. I have a history of sleep paralysis and other sleep issues, but this is something that I have never felt before. I have had multiple experiences with the unexplained and paranormal side of things, but this just seems different. Could this be my own paranoia? Some weird shit happened to me about a year ago, and I haven't shared it with anyone because I'm afraid they'll think I'm crazy or not believe me. Anyway, at a family gathering at my grandma's house, my mom and I decided to go get some KFC for the family around noonish or so. Once we pulled up to the drive-thru, we waited for a little bit, and nobody was talking to us through the speaker thing. So after waiting, we decided to just pull up to the window. We noticed no one was there, so we thought, okay, fuck it, let's go inside. As we walk up, we see the whole restaurant looks closed, and the doors were locked. Lights are all off, and it's empty. No customers, no employees. There was even a row of high chairs that were put up on the counter, like when a restaurant is closed. We basically said fuck it again, and decided to go get pizza. About 20 to 30 minutes on our drive home from getting the pizza, we passed the same KFC, and my mom sees that it has cars in the drive-thru. My grandma was expecting chicken, so we stopped to get some chicken. Here's where it gets really fucking weird. We walk inside in order, then ask the lady why they opened so late. She gave us a confused look and said they've been open since 10 a.m. As I looked around, there were families who looked like they've been sitting there for a while, eating and chilling. I was so weirded out, I actually asked a family how long they were there for. They were nice people and told me for about an hour. My mom and I have never said anything to anyone, because we still don't know what the fuck happened. I even thought maybe the employees were late, so the cashier tried pulling one on me, but the family made me reconsider that. I don't know. Weird AF. And wondering if anything similar has ever happened to anyone. This happened a couple of weeks ago, and I'm still in disbelief. Little background, I work second shift and get off late at night, where cops are on the hunt for drunk drivers. Quite literally, like the title says, I was driving home from work when I pulled up to a red light. With me at the light was a police officer, nothing too out of the ordinary, but after the light turned and they sped off, I maintained a decent tail on the cop, never taking my eyes off of them. With me at the light was a police officer, nothing too out of the ordinary, but after the light turned and they sped off, I maintained a decent tail on them, never taking my eyes off the car. I cannot stress the fact that that isn't an over-exaggeration, because I for sure did not stop looking at the cop car. Eventually I caught up to the car and boom, it was just a normal car. I never saw another car join us on the road. Nobody passed me, and nobody left the road. The cop car didn't turn off, and I didn't lose sight of the car. I obviously wasn't under the influence of anything save caffeine, which I'm accustomed to. It's honestly freaking me out, still. My mother and 2 older brothers would visit my auntie and 3 cousins around Christmas. The whole family would get together too, uncles, aunties, you name it. Anyway, they lived up near Inverness, in Scotland, in a place called the Black Isle. It's actually in a place called Cromarty, but Inverness is more well known, so I'll say that. The Black Isle was said to be used back in the day as a place where witches would meet up on Halloween and perform rituals, animal sacrifices, that kind of thing. Whether or not that's true is something else entirely. I'll get on to the story now. We all rented out a holiday home just down the road from my cousin's house. It had multiple bedrooms in it, so it was perfect for a lot of guests. Me and one of my older brothers and his friend from Africa were all staying in one room. They were fast asleep. I, however, was not. I woke suddenly and didn't know why. I scanned the room with my bleary eyes. It was very dark, and I couldn't hear anything but the snores from my brother and his friend. The door to the room slowly opened with a creak, and I swear I froze with fear. I didn't see anything enter through it, but as I tried to scan my eyes around the room, I started to see shadow-like figures pulsating and hovering around the 2 adjacent beds, over my brother and his friend. There must have been at least 3 or 4 of these figures. The third one stood over my bed. Although this apparition didn't have any human-like features except maybe the shape of something human, I could still feel that it was staring right at me. I decided then the only course of action was to turn over and face the wall and go to sleep. The morning after, I described my experience to a few of my family members, and they joked that it might be the witches that performed those rituals in the past, and in general just didn't believe me. Except one person, my brother's girlfriend. She told me she had experienced something as well. She was only sleeping next door, and she said that she felt like someone had sat down on the end of her bed in the night, and said that she could feel the weight of someone on her legs, but nothing was there. Very frightened by this, I decided to read the guest book to see if anyone else had reported anything unusual, but nothing of the sort could be found. I'll never forget what I saw that night, and if you're ever up near the Black Isle or stay in the same holiday home I did, just be aware of strange figures entering your room at night. One of my best friends and I really don't know how we ended up in each other's lives. And no, I don't mean in a cutesy, where did I find you type of way. I mean that neither of us remember how we got to where we are in our relationship. We met as teens through mutual friends, but were never more than friendly acquaintances at most. Next thing I know, 10 years later, I'm involved in her wedding. She's a bridesmaid at mine. We're at each other's houses multiple times each week, and I even visited her and her daughter in hospital hours after she gave birth. We are super involved in each other's lives, which isn't unusual for close girlfriends. The problem is that there are big, serious details missing. It's like there's a 2 to 3 year gap where lots of important stuff happened that we just don't remember at all. I don't remember meeting her husband, or buying her house. I don't remember the first time I was in said house. And I don't remember her physically changing, despite the fact that she lost a lot of weight and became very involved in working on her appearance. She doesn't remember showing me her house either, or me being anything other than what I am to her now. We just don't know how we got here. It doesn't seem all that important or mind-blowing, but it really unsettles me when I think about it or when we chat about it. It's like there's something to it that I can't quite put my finger on. We also always joke that we are polar opposites, but there might be something to that. At one time, somewhere between our two weddings, I was extremely torn about our relationship. I found her to be so extremely abrasive as a person, but didn't once question the relationship. It's like I just accepted it because she was my best friend. I don't know quite how to explain how it felt. But aside from this, our differences are of the severity that, at the age we were during this gap, we are sure that we would have gotten in the way of us ever being close friends. Was she replaced? Was I replaced? Are my previous memories false? I just don't know. Full disclosure. I have had issues with depression and anxiety in the past, which have their own effects on memory. However, this wasn't affecting me during that part of my life, and I don't have anything similar with any other part of my life. Also, it doesn't explain how we're both on the same page with this. When I, a 24-year-old female, was younger, around 5, my family moved into an old house on the upstairs floor. An older couple lived below us. This was a long time ago, and I was really little, but I remember this all so vividly. When we were first moving in, my mom had to go up to the attic, which, coincidentally, the door was in what would be my room. She took me and my younger brother up with her because I'm assuming she didn't want to leave us unsupervised. I remember not liking it up there, and then the light turned off. Both my brother and I started screaming about red eyes. I do remember them. It wasn't just one. It was a bunch or a few. I couldn't tell you how many. It turns out that the light turning off was my dad because he didn't think anyone was up there. He turned the light back on and asked what was going on, and me and my brother were still hysterical. The thing is, no one remembers this but me. Not even my brother. I chalk it up to a bad nightmare, except for the fact that I remember every detail. And it turns out a mother had drowned her baby in that attic, and my parents had experiences there as well. I feel like that house was the start of my acknowledgement or awareness of the paranormal. I should start by saying that I am sensitive, but have never known about or tried any of my abilities to sense the paranormal. I recently stayed at the Stanley Hotel in New York. After pulling onto the property, I immediately felt extremely uneasy and had a sense of dread. Just an overall bad feeling about the place. After entering the building, I started feeling nauseous and lightheaded like I was going to pass out, and weird stabbing pains were all around my head. Not a normal headache. As the night progressed, I started getting flashing images in my head depicting horrible, violent, graphic scenes of myself being stabbed and choked, and figures who were standing over me. I felt as if I weren't alone in my own head. I felt random bursts of anger and sadness and would want to either hurt the people that I was with, or just start hysterically crying. I have never felt so out of control, like my head was in a fog, and everything that was happening was a dream, like I was there in my head, but I couldn't control my body. It has been 5 days since I left, and I still don't feel like myself. What happened to me in that hotel? This happened earlier last week at my sister's house. She lives about 5 minutes from me and has a 1-year-old baby girl who, when she goes to sleep, has a baby monitor in her room to make sure that everything is okay. Anyway, my sister had just finished putting my niece to sleep and I was watching her on the baby monitor. Nothing crazy, and it was during the middle of the week around 7:30 p.m. Well, my sister comes downstairs and we make some small talk while I'm on my phone. Then I randomly decide to check the baby monitor, where there is a clear view of a rocking chair in place about 3 feet away from the crib. I saw myself sitting there, wearing a t-shirt and shorts, looking down at my phone in the rocking chair. I was absolutely horrified, and I screamed to my sister about it, and it scared the crap out of her. I had never seen anything like it in my life, and I didn't know how to react. When I looked up and she came rushing over to check the monitor, I was gone. Nothing. Just my niece sleeping in her crib in the dark. The rocking chair, totally empty. Obviously, we had to go and check on her, and I was terrified, and my sister had a bat, but no one was there but her. Nothing was out of place. I wasn't wearing what I had on that night, though. I was clearly wearing a white t-shirt and gym shorts with Nikes on. I had my glasses on and you could see the bright cell phone screen in the dark as I hunched over to look at it. I never looked at the camera but could tell that it was me, and I have not been able to sleep much since then. I can't get that picture out of my head, and the baby monitor doesn't record video, or else I would have gone back and looked. It's probably the craziest thing to ever happen to me in my life. I was not high or drunk or anything like that. It was a normal weekday after work. This happened about 15 years ago. I woke up that day feeling really odd, and my very good friend back then called me and said that she woke up also feeling weird, so I told her to come over. We couldn't shake this strange feeling off. Something just felt weird, but we couldn't put a finger on it. We decided to go out in the evening, and when we were walking through Piccadilly Circus in London, something crazy happened. The closest thing that I could compare it to would be that we ended up in this see-through bubble, and everything around us paused for about 3 seconds, and we were, me and her, in sort of slow motion while we were in that bubble. And then snap, and everything went back to normal, but we stood there looking at each other completely and utterly freaked out, as we both experienced the same thing. We just stood there in shock, thinking, what the fuck just happened? We were so shaken by this that we had one drink in the bar and decided to go home. She went to mine as she didn't want to be alone, So we took the train back, and while we were walking to my house, we heard a gunshot. And that bullet passed me by an inch and went into a car that was parked next to us on the side of the road. I literally felt it touch my hair while flying past me. There was a guy in the car who got out and started screaming and panicking as the bullet hit the side door, and we stood there petrified, thinking, what the fuck is happening today? We then ran off and sprinted all the way to my house. The area I used to live in back then is one of the safest areas in London. It was by St. Catherine's Docks by Tower Hill, so whoever is from London can relate. Also, gun crime in the UK is very rare, pretty much below zero, so this whole incident just didn't make any sense. I don't know whether it was related to the slow motion thing earlier and the world pausing, but I couldn't help but think to myself that if I had walked there a second earlier, I would have gotten hit. There are many stories from border crossers. Many people see ghosts and other things. I knew this one lady. She was a friend of my parents. She crossed to the desert to get to the U.S. She was with a group of people and the coyote led them. It was nighttime and the people rested. The coyote said to keep going because they'd lost a lot of time, so they got up and continued walking. Well, they came in front of this bushy-like place, and when you crossed, the tips of the branches caught your clothes. It was dark and hard to see, but they were in a line and followed each other. The lady I know was tired from walking just like everyone else was, but she said there was this old man next to her who complained about how he was in pain and just too tired to continue. Soon they passed by this trench. It was so dark that you couldn't see how far down it was before it stopped. They walked next to the trench, and the old lady told me that the bushes kept scratching her face and getting at her clothing. The lady then said that she turned around to look at the old man next to her and saw that he had tripped and fallen down in the trench, but he didn't make any noise. The lady got scared and panicked. She told her husband, and the husband told the coyote to stop, that a man fell in the ditch. The coyote had a flashlight and he shined it down into the trench, and it wasn't that deep. He went down with the flashlight, but he didn't see any man. The lady told her husband that she knew he was there. She said that he fell right in front of her. The coyote was getting impatient. He looked everywhere, but still couldn't see anyone. He never found the man, and obviously he couldn't have made it very far in such a short amount of time. I guess he thought that she was lying or something, and decided to keep on moving. Soon they crossed the desert safely and all. The lady said that she thought it was weird how he fell. She said that it was a trip, but it was like he was sinking in his fall. She asked the others if they had seen him fall, and they all said no. The lady never saw that old man in the group after that. I don't really like this story because it makes me think of what might have taken him. I also heard that there are giant bugs in the desert or something like that. My family visited her house. When she told us this story, I was super scared and kept thinking about it at night. There are many people crossing the desert that have seen dead people walking around and see weird things following them at night. Myself, my younger cousin, and a couple of friends stayed recently at one of the most haunted places in Texas and America. As a kid, I had heard stories of this old hotel and the dark history behind it. In recent years, a few paranormal shows showcased and did some investigations there. When I saw in our local news that the Magnolia Hotel was opening back up for visitors to stay the night, I was stoked. When you stay the night, you get 2 rooms, regardless of whether you're staying by yourself or you're bringing company. Also, you get the whole second story to yourself for you to investigate. There is a door that separates the hotel, updated, side and the haunted rooms side. To be fair, the rooms that you stay in are haunted as well. The entire hotel is haunted. Needless to say, I recorded so much activity on tape and in person in my own experiences. The findings I have will raise the hairs on your body. I was hearing voices, seeing shadows, hearing footsteps, showing the EVP sessions and hearing our names. I actually got touched twice, and the second time was so chilling. We were outside of this room that had a ton of activity. My friend had the dowsing rods. She asked if there was a spirit, and 3 times it pointed directly at me. She asked if the spirit was next to me. The rods said no. She asked if it was behind me, and they said yes. At that moment, I felt someone grab my right shoulder and slowly move their hand down my back. I got cold chills and felt tingling and numbing for a good few minutes. I am planning to go back very soon. I am a sensitive. I attract ghosts, and I go ghost hunting quite a bit. I have other experiences from several places that are extremely haunted here in Texas and in other states as well. I work in a prison in the UK. I always like to work nights because you do 7 days on and 7 days off. While on nights, I got locked onto a wing with no keys. We have a sealed pouch with a cell key inside for emergencies, if someone is hanging and I need to cut them down, etc., that kind of thing. I'm in charge of looking after 200 plus prisoners. After a few busy hours answering cell bells and doing my checks on people who are essentially on suicide watch, the wing starts to settle down. The stories I'm including here are very small portions of things that have happened to me on night shifts. Story 1. One night I was doing my checks. I heard a loud bang coming from the ones landing outside the servery. When I went inside to investigate, there was a broom on the floor. When I reviewed the CCTV footage, you can clearly see the broom slowly being lifted away from the wall where it was resting, and then quickly getting thrown to the ground. We have the footage copied, and most of the people at work have seen it. We usually show it to new staff before they do their first night shift to freak them out. Story 2. One night we had someone overdose. I was working the week after all this happened, and the cell was locked off for the police investigation and was completely empty. At about 3:30 in the morning, the cell bell for that room was pressed. At first I didn't even know that this cell belonged to the guy that had died the previous week, but as soon as I looked into the empty cell, I realized, and just froze. It takes a lot to freak me out. But I didn't walk back on that part of the landing until roll count. Story 3. This one is more minor, but still equally as creepy. Things that happened just last week that prompted me to share this. While walking on the 3's landing, one of the showers on the 2's turned on by itself. The only way to turn it on is to press a button on the wall inside the shower. I went to investigate, and the showers were locked, and the lights inside were turned off. This was about 2:30 a.m. Approximately 30 minutes later, I was walking down the 2's landing and an office door slammed shut. I checked the landings for open windows, and they were all shut. Again, every time I hear a noise, I always investigate, and love anything creepy, but this sent shivers down my spine. In 2007, I moved into the house I currently live in. It's over 100 years old, and ever since I can remember there have been weird or creepy things that occur. Recently, I've heard noises late at night while I'm in bed. For context, I sleep on the top floor of my house, and it's been getting really creepy. Another thing is that in the hallway we have an attic door that's bolted shut and hasn't been opened by our family or my neighbors who used to live here from what I have been told. I decided to ask my father about it, and he told me that it wasn't a full-size attic, and is more of a crawl space which goes right over my room. And the part that creeps me out the most is that we've never had any animals besides the occasional mouse in our home, which makes me think that what I'm hearing doesn't sound like an animal at all. This just happened today, and it still got me freaked out. I was sitting watching TV when movement in the kitchen caught my eye, and I looked up to see my husband, who'd been taking a nap in the bedroom, standing in the kitchen doorway, watching me. He was wearing his MASH PJs. I looked at him and said, "You okay?" He didn't answer me, and just kept staring. I turned to put the remote on mute and pause, so I could see if he was okay since he just stood there silently staring at me. It took me about 2 seconds to do that, but when I looked up, my husband was gone. The kitchen was silent, so I got up and went into the bathroom thinking he went in there. The bathroom was dark and empty, so I turned into our bedroom to see if he was in there getting dressed. I about crapped my pants when I saw him still laying across the bed, sound asleep, in his jeans and Realtree t-shirt. It dawned on me then that who I saw in the kitchen hadn't been my husband, even though it looked like him, and was wearing PJs that my husband actually owns, but wasn't currently wearing at that time. I can't figure out what happened, or why, or how I saw what I did. If you guys can figure it out, or have a good guess, please let me know, because I'm still unnerved. It was creepy. I've always been pretty sensitive, and so have quite a few people in my family. I've seen dark figures, recorded a few voices, but nothing too major before this story. It was my senior year of high school, and I had been going through a period of what some may like to call paranormal investigating with my friends. We were spending time visiting cemeteries and abandoned houses, like most teenagers do. Just having fun being scared. Well, my friend Tyler found this Ouija board in an abandoned house that he had explored a month or so back and asked me if I wanted it. You see, he knew I was into the paranormal with all the love I had for being scared. I liked scary movies, haunted houses, and anything to get the adrenaline going. So of course I said yes. My friends Alex, David, and I decided to skip school, and I asked them if they wanted to use this Ouija board with me. They were along for the ride, and we had planned to find a place to do this. My house. My house was already known to be haunted because due to some experiences that I had had in my basement. So it seemed like the appropriate choice. Now my friend David didn't believe in anything paranormal. No ghosts or any of that stuff. So he decided to film this for us. Alex is sitting across from me, and I have my hands on the eye by myself. I figured you weren't supposed to do this alone from what I had seen in movies, but we did it anyway, just to see what would happen. Alex begins to ask some questions. Basic ones at first, like, is there anyone here with us? What's your name? What do you want? Alex then asks, are you trying to hurt Chris? And nothing really happens in that moment. But I do remember this distinct chill run down my spine. I brushed it off. We decided to watch the video back on David's phone just to see what it looked like. As we're watching this back, when it comes to the question of, are you trying to hurt Chris? In the video, my head tilts back and I say yes, in two different voices. One in my own voice, and one in a deep, guttural voice. We all look at each other and exclaim, "Oh my God." You didn't say that. You didn't say anything. And needless to say, we got rid of that board and never really talked about it again. But that was one of the most terrifying experiences I have ever had. Last week, at the end of a long shift at a historic hotel, I saw a glimpse of a petite woman with a blonde bob and long beige coat staring up at a wall. It resembled a former manager who had worked there pre-COVID shutdown, but after a second I remembered that she wasn't back to work yet. When I realized this and looked back to where she was, no one was there. My coworker and I quickly scoured the area, but it was vacant. I wrote it off as a benign spirit, as I've experienced some friendly activity there over the years. She just seemed curious or lost. However, I was talking with this former manager on the phone a couple days later, and she told me that she'd just had a dream that she was back working at the hotel and described exactly where she was in the dream. It was the precise location where I had seen the figure. Now, I'm not sure what I believe. My wife is a travel nurse, and we've been living here in Gallup, New Mexico for about 3 months now. We actually only have a week left here, and I'm glad. From the first day we arrived, we felt like something was off. We thought maybe it was just being in a new place, though we haven't felt that way in our previous locations. And maybe because the desert is so radically different from what we're used to. Just a little bit about Gallup. The demographic here is a majority Navajo with some Zuni and Hopi people as well. Gallup is landlocked by these 3 reservations, and the nearest city is Albuquerque, which is about 2 hours away. Now, despite what I just mentioned, being a non-native here in Gallup is not a big deal at all. There's no radical tension issues that we've experienced during our stay. In fact, we've really liked the people we've met here. Yet there is a burning feeling inside of me, like I shouldn't be here, and that we need to leave. And my wife told me that she feels the same thing. As for psychics and feeling negative energy and all that stuff, I personally think it's probably just a bunch of hooey. That's not what I'm saying here. This is more like an instinct that we need to leave and not renew the contract here. And it is only in Gallup. We stayed in Ruidoso a few years ago and loved it there. We have traveled to many places surrounding Gallup and felt fine, but as soon as we came home from the trips, there was that feeling of something being not right. About 30 seconds ago, I was sitting on the couch as my dog walked by to go sit on our bed we have behind the L part of the sectional. She had something small caught in her throat last night, I think a popcorn shell, so I was paying attention to her breathing just to make sure that she got it out. For a few minutes, she was breathing fine, and then what sounded like a light snore started happening. This is semi-normal for her depending on what position she's laying in, so I didn't bother to go over and check. That went on for about 5 minutes, until the most disgusting, and to my now realization terrifying, snore, cough, wheezing sound started happening. I go over to her to make sure she's okay, and the exact moment I looked at her bed, the sound stopped, mid-breath, and she wasn't there. She was outside with my parents. Had been for around 30 minutes. There's no way to get out of the room without walking right past me. I don't know whose fucking dog I saw, or what was making that creepy-ass sound 5 feet away from me. But I'm going to be staying outside for the rest of the day, and hiring an exorcist. My boyfriend and I decided to take an impromptu trip to Gettysburg and booked a decently priced hotel the night before. The first night I fell asleep no problem, but the second night, not so much. He had already gone to bed, and I had just shut the light off. As soon as the light was out, I could hear paper or bags shuffling around on our TV stand, and I thought that he had gotten up to look for something. I looked up, and of course no one was there, but I instantly felt terrified and felt the presence of someone standing at the foot of our bed. It only lasted about a minute or so, and then suddenly there was a loud bang, like a door being slammed in the room above us, and the feeling disappeared. When we got home, my boyfriend, who doesn't believe in the supernatural at all, extremely reluctantly brought up how the first night that we stayed, he got up to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night and immediately got creeped out and thought that someone was in our room. He went into the bathroom and felt like someone was standing directly behind him. Of course, Gettysburg has tons of history, but after doing some research, I haven't found much information about the hotel or what may have been there before. Whatever happened in our room didn't feel harmless, though. This took place in the summer of 2010. I was with my family and we went down to the USA for vacation that year. We stayed at the hotel we normally stayed at, which was a Red Roof Inn. As we walked in, something felt off about the room, and I thought to myself that it must be just nothing. Over the next few nights, always around 3 in the morning, my mother and I would hear a knocking against the wall. At first we thought, oh, maybe it's just the people next door. However, the room was empty, and we thought nothing of it until it kept happening. I was wondering, could it possibly be haunted? My mother, being super into the paranormal and believing in this as I do myself, we decided to take a statue of the Archangel Michael from my dad's dashboard. It was super small, nothing big, and the next thing you know, we never heard the knocking for the rest of the trip. So it is possible that the room was haunted, and after doing some reading, we think that it could have been a poltergeist. I work in procurement for a large corporation. I meet with a lot of salespeople. In the industry in my area, people move around to different companies a lot. A familiar person came in. I had done a significant amount of business with him at the onset of my career 10 years ago. I said, "Hi Steve, it's been a while. When did you leave Acme?" He looked confused and said, "I never worked for them." I let it die, and everyone chalked it up as mistaken identity. The problem is that I immediately recognized him. We had spent a lot of time together on a project. His voice and mannerisms were very familiar. I was kind of spooked. Later, I tried to locate my former associate, and I cannot. I'm renting a house currently with some of my friends, and since we moved in this summer, there was an attic door that had a lock on it from our landlord. Well, me and my friend got curious and decided to try and pick the lock. We ended up getting the combination, and when we went up there, I took 3 photos. One is of the front window, one of the back, and one was of an odd postcard on the ground. I sent a photo to a friend, and without me realizing, there was a very clear face in the window with distinct features, eyes, nose, mouth, and head shape. Prior to this, there had been no experiences in the house besides some odd noises. My housemate claims he saw the same face in a different window today, after we locked the attic back up. I'm scared that we may have woken something, and I honestly want nothing to do with it.